When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a little boy, his father took him to the White House where he met President Grover Cleveland. "I'm making a strange wish for you, little man," Cleveland said as he placed his hand on Roosevelt's head. "I wish for you that you may never be President of the United States."
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Ironically, Roosevelt was elected president, an unprecedented 4 times. His first term began on March 4th, 1933. He died during his 4th term on April 12th, 1945, at the age of 63. On the morning of his death, he was at his cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia, going through paperwork as an artist painted his portrait. Around 1 p.m., he placed his hand to his temple and announced that he had, quote, "a terrific headache." He died of a cerebral hemorrhage shortly thereafter.
Shall we gather at the river where bright angel feet have trod, with its crystal tide forever flowing by the throne of God?
Roosevelt was born in the family's affluent Hyde Park, New York home on January 30th, September 1905, after he graduated from Harvard, but before he had finished Columbia University Law School, Franklin married his 5th cousin once removed, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, and he gave her away at her New York City wedding to Franklin. Eleanor hired 22-year-old Lucy Mercer to act as her social secretary. In 1918, Eleanor found love letters that her husband exchanged with Mercer. Despite his promise to end the affair, Mercer spent time with Roosevelt whenever Eleanor was not around. She was with him the day he died. In 1921, at the age of 39, he was struck with polio. The athletic 6'1" Roosevelt never regained use of his legs, and the public remained largely unaware of the extent of his disability. Eleanor once said that he became more compassionate following his paralysis. Those who were close to him agreed that he was never uncomfortable about his condition and remained composed and good-natured when he required assistance from others. Roosevelt once said, "A radical man is a man with both feet firmly planted in the air. A conservative man is a man with 2 perfectly good legs who, however, has never learned to walk forward. A liberal is a man who uses his legs and his hands at the behest of his head." Dwight Eisenhower commented that he couldn't agree with all of FDR's liberal political acts, but thought that during the war, he was an exceptional leader. Those close to Roosevelt believed that he was outwardly optimistic, had a great imagination, and was fearless. He was, however, a reserved man, and did not easily share personal thoughts. The public came to know him when he was the governor of New York from 1929 until 1933. Roosevelt delivered fireside chats, informal radio broadcasts that later became the hallmark of his presidency. An avid bird watcher and stamp collector, he loved to play cards, and each afternoon conducted what he called the Children's Hour, a time in which he mixed cocktails for his friends.
In fulfilling my duty to report upon the State of the Union, I am proud to say to you that the spirit of the American people was never higher than it is today.
And come north on either Amtrak or Metro North to Hyde Park. This is what it would look like along the Hudson River. It's about 2 hours, either by car or by train. And you're approaching the home of the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There you can see a camera shot from the balcony of the home looking down toward the Hudson. And today we are live from this home called Springwood, where FDR was born, where he spent his childhood and teenage years, and where he returned throughout the course of his life. Next door, within short walking distance, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library, the first of the presidential libraries, opened in 1941, and the library designed and used by the president while he was president. Fireside chat right from inside there. And on our set, which is right outside of the home, is David Kennedy, a professor at Stanford University, just finished a book, Freedom from Fear, that we had on book notes, and he's here to help us through these 3 hours. Professor Kennedy, sum up for us, what were the circumstances in America in 1932 that led to the election of FDR as president?
Well, 1932 was probably one of the greatest crises in American history, comparable with the firing on Fort Sumter in 1861 that precipitated the Civil War, or indeed with the outbreak of World War II in 1941. It was the depth, the deepest, most awful moment of the so-called Great Depression. At the time of Roosevelt's election in November of 1932, our estimate is that 25% of the American workforce was unemployed. 13 million people, 1 out of every 4 households, had no wage earner in it, no certain prospects, no income. I suppose a short answer to the question is, why did the country choose Franklin Roosevelt at that moment, is because he was anybody but Herbert Hoover. Hoover was thoroughly discredited by his inability to come to grips with the Depression. And the country was looking for any alternative. The country in 1932 had no very clear idea precisely what Roosevelt would do, either about the Depression or about the other issues of the time. He was largely unknown political quantity outside the state of New York, despite the fact that he'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy and had some visibility in the World War I era. But again, it takes, given the affluent era in which we've all lived for the last half century since the end of World War II, it takes a certain effort of the imagination, I think, for all of us to understand just how desperate the country was in 1932. What were the social and political and psychological implications of this tremendous economic calamity that is known to history as the Great Depression?
As you all know, we want you to join us by phone. It's always more spontaneous parts of these programs. The numbers are right there on the screen. You can begin dialing now, and we'll get you on the air right away. Back in 1932, FDR got 22,800,000 votes. Herbert Hoover got 15,700,000, and Norman Thomas 881,000. Was that a big win in those days?
That was a very big win. In those days or any other days, that would be a big win. A lesser win than Roosevelt managed 4 years later, 1936, when he won by the largest majority in American history up to that time. But no, this was 1932 was an overwhelming repudiation of the Hoover administration and an endorsement of Roosevelt's program, which at that time was defined simply as action, action, the country wants action.
On your screen in a moment, you're going to see the desk that FDR used inside the White House, sitting right as you walk in the open door there of the museum, and that's the same desk that Herbert Hoover used, and the chair is very similar to what Herbert Hoover had. A lot of the trinkets that he kept on his desk, including both donkeys and elephants, as they say there on the sign to stay bipartisan. We have a call waiting for David Kennedy in Louisville, Kentucky. Our first call. Good morning.
Brian, how are you?
Fine.
I think, I don't know if there'll be many callers like me today, but I think Roosevelt's gotten a very good press since his death, and I think that's largely because his history is generally written by liberal historians, but I think he's really one of our worst presidents. On domestic issues, he really began the centralization of the federal government and taking over more of our lives and our economy. He began the Ponzi scheme of Social Security. He tried to pack the Supreme Court. On foreign policy, he couldn't wait to recognize Stalin's Russia, really the greatest mass murderer in history, and he really did his best to violate neutrality for 2 years to get us into World War II. A lot of people don't realize that in August and September of '41, Roosevelt actually froze Japanese assets in the United States to try to provoke an attack, which he succeeded in doing. And I think that's generally suppressed in academia and the media.
Thanks.
Well, that's quite an indictment. Let me start with the last point. Actually, the Roosevelt administration froze Japanese assets in July of 1941, not in September. And again, the strategic situation was such at that moment that the last thing that anybody in either the United States or Britain wanted was a war with Japan, because both Churchill and Roosevelt and everyone around them understood that the strategic adversary was Germany, not Japan. Japan was a tremendous aggravation and a nuisance, and in fact, but not a strategic enemy. And the great worry on Churchill's part, in fact, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, was that this would distract the Americans into waging their principal war in the Pacific and not in the Atlantic against Germany, where the Americans were really needed.
You're going to meet Diane Boyce in just a few moments. She'll tell us more about the House and knows a lot about Mrs. Roosevelt, Sarah Roosevelt, the mother of FDR. Carolina, Rhode Island, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm putting my TV down. I just would totally like to disagree with that conservative Kentucky man that, and I live below World War II veterans and Depression-era veterans, and can you explain like how close we were to becoming? I heard there was a lot of conservative New York elements that were trying to actually overthrow the government, and if it wasn't for FDR, we could have actually lost our democracy. And I just think that was the most ridiculous comment that person ever said. This FDR probably most likely saved our country, and thank God for him. Thank you.
Professor Kennedy.
Well, I think the last two calls, which are also the first two calls in this program, illustrate that Roosevelt to this day, even half a century on after his death, remains a tremendously controversial figure. I suppose my sympathies are more with the second caller, that I think Roosevelt, in fact, deserves enormous credit in the historical record for saving the country, saving it from the threat of some kind of really drastic political upheaval in the face of this continuing economic crisis called the Depression, and deserves credit a second time, I think, for putting the United States into the war on the side of the democracies and taking a big share of the responsibility for the defeat of Hitler and Japanese aggression in Asia.
One of the things we like to do is help teachers better use this product free of charge in the classrooms. We have a telephone number that we show you from time to time that we like to ask all teachers to call if they want to get involved. There's no cost to sign up. It's 202-626-4858. As this series has progressed, we've got a lot of new materials. We're going to send them out to you if you dial this number or go to our website at cspan.org/classroom. Again, that's 202-626-4858. David Kennedy, back in 1933, I wrote a whole bunch of numbers down about the Congress. In the United States Senate, there were 59 Democrats and 36 Republicans. There were 313 Democrats and 117 in the House. Were they all for FDR when they were in those years? I mean, the Democrats?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the Democrats have been out of power for more than a decade, since the Wilson administration. And in fact, the Wilson administration had been one of only 2 Democratic presidencies since the Civil War. So the Democratic Party at that moment in history was not used to leading. They were in the mindset, you might say, of an opposition party. So they were quite hungry for presidential leadership and for making their mark and establishing a political identity. So they were very susceptible to leadership. Now, as it turned out, as history went on, time went on, there were factions within the Democratic Party that resisted Roosevelt's leadership quite strenuously, particularly in 1937, the Supreme Court packing controversy. He lost a lot of support inside his own party, and that was, for all effective purposes, the end of the New Deal by 1937.
Lorain, Ohio, you're our next caller for Professor David Kennedy. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Brian. I have 2 questions, basically. One is the Presidential Library in Hyde Park there. They say it's the first in the United States. I thought Rutherford B. Hayes' library in Fremont, Ohio, was the first ever. And my second one, is it true that Roosevelt, in all his public elections, never carried his home county of Dutchess County?
Actually, to be honest, I'm not sure of either point. It's always been my understanding that this was the first presidential library, organized as the repository for the full collection of papers of the administration and to be the central spot for doing research in this era.
Well, the Hayes Library was opened in 1916. This one was opened in 1941. I've never really understood that. Maybe Diane Boyce can tell us. Do you have any idea, Diane Boyce, why this place claims to be the first presidential library and the Hayes Library is left out?
It's because FDR wanted to bring home all of his papers, have researchers come to be able to use them, have the history of his administration in one place. In previous years, presidents had taken their papers either to the university or college they attended, and sometimes even home with them, and records were lost to history.
How long have you been attached to this Hyde Park area?
I've been here, I'm a native Hyde Parker, but I've worked here at the site for 18 years.
And what about this house over here, which is right in front of you, is the most interesting to people who visit it?
I think they're surprised at how modest it is. When they come, they expect a mansion. FDR never wanted it called an estate. He called it the place. And he was very comfortable. I'm done.
If Diane's a native Hyde Parker, maybe she knows the answer to the question about whether Roosevelt ever carried Dutchess County in a presidential election.
I can answer that.
What's the answer?
Well, actually, the 4 times he ran for president, he never carried his home county and he never carried his hometown.
Is it still a Republican area?
Oh, very much so, yes.
Let me grab a call. This one is San Francisco. Good morning.
Good morning. Even though I live in San Francisco, I grew up in Newburgh, New York, which is across the river and about 15 miles south of Hyde Park. And the Delanos were very big in that area. And I have a brief anecdote and then a question which fits in with what you were just saying. My mother actually met Eleanor Roosevelt in the high school in Newburgh. She literally ran into her in between classes and knocked her down. But Mrs. Roosevelt was very gracious about it, and my mother was very taken aback, but Mrs. Roosevelt was very nice about it. And my question was, since I grew up in that area, and as you just said, it is very highly Republican, I was wondering how Franklin Delano Roosevelt did become a Democrat, and also his cousin Theodore was a Republican. So. And thank you for the series on the presidents, and I'll get off the air and listen to
Diane, thank you. Diane Boyce, do you have any idea?
Yeah, actually, it's sort of a mystery how they became Democrats. FDR's father was a Democrat, and he was the town supervisor for a while, and they just seem to have a lot of exemplify the Democratic ways of doing things. Some of it maybe from growing up here and working with the staff, working with the people who ran the farm, ran the property.
David Kennedy, he was 30 years old, though, when he was elected to the New York Senate from here. So he had to carry this area.
He carried the larger area, yes, that's right. Well, he had this magical name. His distant cousin Theodore had just been serving as president. So he had great, what we would today call name recognition, high profile, and that began his political career in 1910.
Bob Riley is behind one of the cameras inside the home, right behind David Kennedy, and you'll see a picture here in a moment or two. We've got a fairly large crowd here this morning. This is one of the busiest weekends of the year. About 140,000 people visit here every year, and we go to Laurel, Maryland next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes. My comment to the experts there, and I would like a quick discussion. I think most of the American people, when it comes to history and anything complex like Roosevelt, are I don't know a better word than idiots. I mean, our historians take like the whole New Deal, the whole era, and boil it down to one sentence for a whole, for a whole decade. Like, Roosevelt created the New Deal, and then like, a kid today in school would think like, wow, he must have just been the greatest man. And like, you take something like what Pat Buchanan's been saying, the last 2 months, a complicated historical argument that's either true or not true, or at least an opinion, and people boil it down to he's an anti-Semite or he's not. And I'm wondering what people who take this seriously and know that history is always complicated and that it can never be boiled down to something so simple. What's your real feeling about the American public where you're talking to a selected audience like C-SPAN who actually does, who actually do care about, what happened and the intricacies of it?
Caller, tell me about yourself. What do you do?
Basically, I take care of my children, and I'm trying to get my children into politics.
Do you have a job?
I take care of my children.
That's your job. Okay, that's all I want to know. Thanks, Mr. Kennedy.
Well, there's a famous saying of Clara Booth Luce, attributed to her anyway, that history gives everybody at the most just one sentence. George Washington, he created the country. Abraham Lincoln, he saved the country. Winston Churchill, he saved Europe. Franklin Roosevelt, well, actually, I think even in the most spare historical account, Franklin Roosevelt gets two sentences. One, he kept the country together during the Great Depression, and two, he helped win World War II. Those are both tremendous achievements, I think.
FDR elected to 4 terms, had how many different vice presidents?
Well, let's see. His first vice president was John Nance Garner, and then Henry Wallace, and then Harry Truman.
And of those 3, Harry Truman went on to be president. What was John Nance Garner like? 2 terms.
John Nance Garner was a very conservative Democrat from Texas. He sat very uneasily in harness with Franklin Roosevelt for 8 years in the vice presidency. Eventually split with him very badly over the Supreme Court packing controversy, and that's why Roosevelt jettisoned him finally and took on Henry Wallace in the campaign of 1940.
For a very brief time, Speaker of the House. Arab, Alabama next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just couldn't sit here and listen to those Yankees talking about Roosevelt. I grew up in the 30s, and I was in World War II, and I came home on braces and crutches, and said I never would walk without braces and crutches, and I went to college on braces and crutches, but I threw those things away. But let me tell you, folks, this thing about Roosevelt. Did you know that my dad, he was in the lumber business here in Alabama, and he lost everything, and we just didn't have anything. We wore 684 clothing and slept under 684 sheets. That was the Guyana sack sheets that Mother washed, and ironed and made us clothing. I didn't even have shoes to even go hunting with. And after after the Civil War. The Civil War, we didn't even have anything. The North, they just ran down on us, and we didn't have any Marshall Plan, and we didn't have anything to help us here, and we pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps. And now those people, they think that we didn't deserve electricity. Well, I can remember when we got that electricity, it was the finest thing in the world.
All right, sir, thank you very much for that, because I want to lead into asking David Kennedy about the TVA, which was a 1933 creation.
Well, good point. I was just going to say, you might think of the TVA as a kind of Marshall Plan for the South, and it was one of the first initiatives in the so-called 100 Days, 1933, when Roosevelt first came to power. And I think it's not too much to say that one of Roosevelt's great objectives as president was to bring the South into the modern world, to overcome the legacy of the Civil War. To lay the foundation, the economic foundation for eventually improving race relations in the South, but to modernize the South, to develop it economically. This was a tremendous objective of New Deal policy.
Diane Boyce, we have a camera in the library inside the house. How long did Sarah, his mother, live in this house, and what was her relationship to her son, FDR?
Sarah came to the house as a bride in 1880. And lived in it until her death in 1941 when she was 87. And she was involved in the design. This room was added to the house in 1915, so she was involved in the design. The 2 chairs that you're looking at the east fireplace side were governor's chairs from his 2 terms as governor of New York State. It was a 2-year term in those days. And she liked to sit in one. FDR would sit in another. And she liked to entertain her guests here on election nights up until her death, of course. She would sit here and entertain whoever might be here with FDR. He liked to come home to vote, tabulate the results of the dining room table, and she would sit in the living room.
Let me ask you a question about when I was here on a tour one time, and that same, they were talking about the library and those chairs there. The guide said that the same thing that you did, that Mother would sit in one chair and FDR would sit in the other, and somebody said, well, where did Eleanor sit? And everybody wanted to know the answer to that. So I want to ask you that. Where did Eleanor sit if those two chairs were put aside for mother and son?
She liked to sit actually next to them sometimes, and sometimes she sat on the west side. She liked to gather the children around her. She liked to read aloud to them and visit with them.
Upstairs later on, we're going to see the bedroom laid out the way it is. During the time that FDR was in this house with Eleanor and his mother, how was that arrangement?
After the house was enlarged in 1915, it was FDR's dressing room and then a master bedroom used by Eleanor and Franklin until the polio attack. Eleanor's dressing room and a room that his mother selected. Both his mother, Sarah, and James's first wife, Rebecca Howland, wrote in their diaries that they picked rooms that faced the driveway so they could see who might be coming. And the guests were given the west side of the house facing the Hudson River, so they'd have the nice view when they woke up in the morning.
In a few minutes, we're also going to meet Hugh Gallagher, who has written a book about FDR, and will talk to us some about what it's like to be in a wheelchair, which he is in, and what kind of life it would have been for FDR. We have a call waiting from Springfield, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Hi, we're 5 girls watching this program since this morning. Our names are Colby, Lori, Cheryl, Lindsay, and Nicole. And we're currently sophomores in high school, and we were wondering basically what the dress period was for the time when FDR was a young boy, because you mentioned earlier that they wore dresses and kilts, and we weren't quite familiar with this.
First, let me ask you why you are watching this in the first place.
Oh, well, we get 20 extra points on our next history test.
Your teacher, you got to tell us the name of your teacher. Somebody's assigning you this kind of activity. Who's the teacher?
Mr. Lassie.
And so everybody in the class gets 20 extra points if they watch this program this morning?
Right, and we were so nervous because it was busy forever, so we kept calling.
And what are you studying in class?
The history, 1945, of the U.S.
And what's the school?
It's Jonathan Dayton High School in Springfield, New Jersey.
Thanks a lot for calling. Diane Boyce, you want to answer that?
The dress code, of course, when FDR was little, ladies would have worn long dresses. His mother, when he was about 4, finally cut his hair and moved him out of dresses into knickers and pants. And at one point, they spent a winter in Washington. She kept him dressed in a Scottish kilt all winter.
We've got some video of FDR in the library. It lasts about 50 seconds, and we're going to roll it now. And Diane Boyce, if you look on your screen, I don't know whether they have audio on this or not, but let's listen to this, and then we'll ask you what it is.
My home on a Sabbath day that has been observed in so many of your home communities as Brotherhood Day. The National Conference of Jews and Christians has set aside a day on which we can meet, not primarily as Protestants or Catholics or Jews, but as believing Americans. A day on which we can dedicate ourselves not to the things that divide, but to the things which unite us. I hope that we have begun to see how many and how important are the things on which we are united. Now, of all times, we require that kind of thinking.
And there on the screen is a live picture from today. And who were the 3 people on that clip, Diane Boyce?
Well, of course, FDR to the right, and his mother closest to the lamp on the left-hand side, and Eleanor Roosevelt with her ever-ready knitting. When they would visit or when they would talk to people in the evening, she liked to pull out her knitting and knit while things were going along. And it's a wonderful family shot. It's one I've never seen before. But it's great to have FDR's voice. I think it's wonderful for our young people, like our callers, to be able to see that and realize, because there's so many years have gone now between the time that FDR was president and this new generation.
Next call, Columbia, South Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I like to read history. And one thing, I was reading U.S. Grant's memoirs a couple of years ago. And of all places, this is where I got the idea how great Roosevelt was. Grant said that Stanton, he was Lincoln's Secretary of War, was a very timid man, and that he'd give a man a job to do, and then watch over him like a hawk to see that he did it. And Grant said Lincoln, on the other hand, will give a man a job to do and leave him alone to get on with it. Now, Roosevelt had to pick, he picked Admiral Nimitz over about 50 admirals, and he picked General Marshall out of the middle of the pack. He picked some incredible men. And then in 1941 and 2, this country was totally not ready for war. Roosevelt had to pick the men that were going to run the industry, like Kaiser and others too numerous to mention. And the man he just had a superhuman judgment and a superhuman confidence in himself. You know, there's a line in God Bless America says, stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. And I think men like Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, he put them there, because I just don't think an average common man, no matter how smart he was, no matter how educated, no matter how experienced, could have possibly done what he did. To be
all right, sir. Thanks for calling this morning, Mr. Kennedy.
Well, great leadership is probably defined as a great personality arising to a great occasion. And again, Roosevelt, whatever the wellsprings of personality from which he drew this unique character of his, he faced two tremendous historical crises and dealt with them, I think both of them, not perfectly, but quite admirably. But you make another good point, actually, about the Grant and Lincoln administrations compared with Roosevelt's. Roosevelt brought to him, or associated with him, a number of extraordinary individuals, some of whom served in his cabinet throughout all of his 3+ terms. Harold Ickes was his only Secretary of Interior. Francis Perkins, his only Secretary of Labor, for more than a decade. Those were extraordinary commitments to public service by those people.
How long did Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State?
Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, for about almost as long, 10, 11 years.
Because making a connection to today, isn't Cordell Hull one of the heroes of the Gore family out in Tennessee? He was a Tennessean.
Yes, he is. Yeah, that's right.
We go next to Phoenix, Arizona. You're on the air.
Hi, I'm Bill Groover. I'm a broadcast journalist, covered American politics for 25 years, including national conventions and the White House, and I teach courses on the presidency at Rio Salado College. A comment that was made about FDR saving the country did eclipse one very important thing he did. In the depths of the Depression, there was a strong pro-communist feeling running through the country. People were in such despair, they thought the system had failed them and didn't work. And a lot of people were thinking of turning to communism. FDR not only saved the country from the Depression eventually and the war, but also saved the Democratic Party and the nation from what would have been communist encroachment on our government and our society.
David Kennedy?
Well, it may be too much to argue that he saved the country from communism in the 1930s, but you're certainly correct that he saved the country from a lot of tumult and upheaval that surely would have ensued if somebody hadn't got a grip on the situation the way he did. In the presidential campaign of 1940, there was a journalist, a columnist, Ann O'Hare McCormick, who wrote a wonderfully perceptive editorial about Roosevelt. She said it was remarkable that looking back over the last 8 years of Depression and the Roosevelt presidency, that the country was still relatively affectionate, was the word that she used. That people were still getting along with one another. The country had not been permanently divided along political and social lines. That was an achievement, I think.
Diane Bush, when people come to the home and we are seated here on the lawn in between the library and the museum and the home, what do they get to see when they walk to the house?
They get to they get to come in the front door. We do guided tours, and so we talk a little bit about FDR's life and growing up here. As I mentioned, they're very surprised about how modest the house is. And they get to look at all of his things that he had here in the home. He purposely wanted to have people come and see what his life had been like here. And then, of course, he wanted them to see the library and walk on the grounds at his view of the Hudson River. He really loved his home. He loved to bring everyone here, loved the property.
I know upstairs there's the actual birth room where he was born. And again, what year was that?
He was born on January 30th in 1882.
What room are we looking at?
You're looking at the boyhood room, which was a room his father said about 3 months after his birth he'd been moved into and FDR and the nurse had been moved in there, and consequently no one got to sleep.
Next call, Hillsville, Virginia. You're on the air.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Fine, welcome.
Yes, I wanted to ask Dr. Kennedy a question. By the way, Dr. Kennedy, I'm enjoying reading your book. I think it's a very good treatment.
Thank you.
What do you think, which of the two influences do you think were perhaps the most strongest on the New Deal, Wilson or TR in the New Nationalism? And I'll hang up and hear your answer. Thank you.
Well, if I had to choose, I suppose I'd say Theodore Roosevelt and the New Nationalism. In fact, you can find many of the accomplished reforms of the New Deal all foreshadowed in the progressive platform that Theodore Roosevelt's presidential platform of 1912, including things like unemployment compensation, old age insurance, what we know as Social Security. So I think that's, even though Franklin Roosevelt served in the Woodrow Wilson administration in World War I and had quite a regard for Woodrow Wilson, I think probably programmatically Theodore Roosevelt was a greater influence.
Concord, New Hampshire, go ahead, please. Concord, New Hampshire, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes, I wanted to ask Diane Boyce and David Kennedy, for that matter, if they could speak a little bit towards the relationship of Louis Howe and FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt and his importance in it.
Diane Boyce, who was Louis Howe?
Louis Howe was a reporter who FDR met when he went to the state senate in 1910. He saw something in young Franklin Roosevelt, and he really felt that FDR was presidential material. He stuck with him. He worked with him when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He did a lot of campaigning, and he was Eleanor's best ally when FDR contracted the polio. Sarah Roosevelt, Franklin's mother, wished he would come home and be a country squire. And Louis Howe and Eleanor together kept FDR's name alive politically, kept FDR's spirits up. He really is the man responsible for the background for FDR becoming President of the United States. And unfortunately, he died in 1936, and both Eleanor and Franklin felt the loss a great deal.
David Kennedy, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, 1933. The Securities and Exchange Commission, 1934. The Federal Communications Commission, 1934. The Federal Housing Authority, 1934. The FBI, 1935. Social Security, August of 1935. Why so many of these organizations that are still here with us today?
Well, I think there's two parts to that answer. One is that this is an extraordinary moment in American history. The American political system was designed in the 18th century by the Founding Fathers to be very difficult to manipulate. So we don't get very many moments in our history when Congress and President agree and do this kind of legislating on a permanent basis. So this is a very unusual moment. And of course it's owes not only to Roosevelt's leadership, but to this crisis atmosphere of the Depression. Why have these things lasted so long and still are part of the fabric of our society? I think because they've proven their merit and their worth, and their cumulative effect, their overall effect, I think, has been to stabilize free market capitalism in a way that we've found not only acceptable, but really quite desirable.
David Kennedy's book is called Freedom from Fear. It's in your bookstores. It's been in there how long now?
Since May.
How's it doing?
Well, we hope it's doing reasonably well.
Diane Boyce, aren't you working on a book?
Yes, I am. I'm working on a pamphlet first and then a book about Sarah Roosevelt, using her diaries and her letters. These folks, the Roosevelts, saved absolutely everything. And the Roosevelt Library next door is a great repository and a great research tool for all of us here at the Park Service. And all of the letters that she wrote and then Eleanor and Franklin wrote to each other have all been saved. She even wrote in some of the letters, please destroy these, please don't keep my scribblings. But Franklin and Eleanor very fortunately did, and so I'm using those. Those are my primary sources, and we hope to change the view a little bit of Sarah Roosevelt. Everyone comes here thinking she was a domineering mother and a difficult person, and the picture isn't quite as black and white as that.
In 1952, at age 19, Hugh Gallagher contracted polio. He was rehabilitated at Warm Springs, Georgia, where FDR made some 42 visits. He was a page at the 1944 Democratic Convention. He's inside the museum, and he has a book called FDR's Splendid Deception. Mr. Gallagher, good morning, and tell us,
hey, good morning.
From your experience since 1952, what does it mean to have polio and to be in that wheelchair?
Well, it changes your life. It gives you a different viewpoint on yourself, your body, how it functions, and how you get around in the world. It is a very great trauma. And Franklin Roosevelt felt every bit of that trauma, but he came out of it. And I think he came out of it a better man.
How long have you studied FDR and his trauma with being in a wheelchair all his life?
Ever since I got polio. When I was 19, I was in an iron lung. After a year and a half of being in a hospital, I went to Warm Springs. And Warm Springs, my therapist was Hazel Stevens, who had been FDR's therapist. So, of course, I asked her daily how FDR handled things. And then as my career developed and I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years, I would meet people who had known Roosevelt. In fact, I had dinner several times with Grace Tully, who had been Roosevelt's secretary after Missy Lahan died. And everyone I met, I asked, how did he handle his disability? How did he feel about using a wheelchair? And it was the accumulation of all these anecdotes and all these reports that ended up with my writing FDR's Splendid Deception.
When did you write it?
I wrote it in, well, I wrote it in the 80s, and it was published in 85. And it's been in print ever since.
How does it affect your life today, other than the obvious of, you know, being in a wheel? I know you took 8.5 hours to get up here in a car.
Yes.
It's not easy to jump on an airplane like it is for others. But how else on a day-to-day basis does it affect your life?
Well, of course, I don't know, because for the last 40 years I've been in a wheelchair. You have to plan everything. You have to think ahead. When you're in the living room and you're moving to the kitchen, you have to say, now, what is it I need from here to there? You have to, in a way, gauge the response of people you meet, because some people are uncomfortable with the wheelchair, and you have to use techniques to make them comfortable. You have limits as to your fatigue level, and you have to worry about sitting too long in one position because you'll have develop pressure sores. You have to see that your limbs are kept stretched. You have to do careful exercises. You can't exercise too much.
In the room there with you are some of the braces that FDR wore. They,
yes.
For the first time here in that March of Dimes display there, are on display. Do you wear braces like that?
I had braces, but I don't have the strength to do anything other than just stand in them. If someone would pull me to a standing position and lean me into crutches. Roosevelt had a good trunk. He had strong side muscles so that he could hitch his braced legs. But the thing that really was difficult for FDR was that he had no butt muscles. He had to always stabilize himself by leaning on the arm of a son or a Secret Service man. And if he were to stand by himself with the cane, the least little breeze would knock him over because he didn't have those muscles that would hold his legs stable. So walking was always a very tricky thing.
On the screen from about 1930, you see FDR obviously walking with braces. We're going to take a call. Hugh Gallagher is going to be with us for a long time. So we go next to Plant City, Florida. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Brian. I'm curious from Mr. Kennedy to find out what would have been the effect on FDR's political career if Huey P. Long, governor of Louisiana, had not been assassinated.
Well, that's one of the great mysteries of the 30s that historians have returned to time and again, because Long does represent the possibility, it seems, of some much more radical response to the crisis of the Great Depression than the New Deal itself. And there's been endless speculation about what would have been the trajectory of Long's career and what would have been the political constituency he might have mobilized had he not been assassinated in September of 1935. But it's all speculation. No one really knows. Roosevelt himself and the people around him thought that Long might get the presidential nomination in 1940. Well, by 1940, of course, the world was at war, and then an additional question arises. What would have been Long's attitude about international relations at that stage of the game? So there are too many unknowns, too many variables in that question to give a sure answer, I think.
If you've just joined us, we're in the middle of the program devoted to the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was born in that house on the screen right there. And we're going to be here for a couple more hours. Phone lines are going to be open. Remember that FDR appointed some 9 people, if my numbers are correct, to the Supreme Court.
I think it's 9, yeah.
And he appointed a Chief Justice, more than anybody in history except George Washington, I guess, who started out with about the same number. Although the court in the beginning wasn't 9, I think it was a smaller court. On the screen is his appointments. Hugo Black, Stanley Reed, Felix Frankfurter, William Douglas, Frank Murphy. Frank Murphy served in his cabinet at some point, or somebody's cabinet.
Murphy was governor of the state of Michigan.
James Burns, Robert Jackson, who William Rink was clerk for when he was at the court, Wiley Rutledge, and then Harlan Fiske Stone was the Chief Justice appointed by Calvin Coolidge in 1925 to the court and then made Chief Justice by FDR. Next call, Albany, New York. Go ahead, please.
I first want to thank C-SPAN for the great series on the presidents. It's the best series I've ever seen on TV.
Oh, thank you, sir.
My question is this. Roosevelt enjoyed entertaining informally. And when King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, who is now the Queen Mother, was visiting from Great Britain and paid a state visit to the United States in '39, the president took them to Hyde Park for a picnic of frankfurters and baked beans. And I was able to attend that and was invited to that picnic. And President Roosevelt was the first president in my 81 years that I had ever seen in person. Thank you.
And legend has it on that occasion he waved goodbye to them here as they left the Hyde Park grounds by saying, "Goodbye, King, goodbye, Queen."
David Kennedy, your first president that you ever saw in person?
Well, the first person who became president that I ever saw in person was John F. Kennedy.
Hugh Gallagher, how about you?
I was present at the FDR funeral procession. I was a little kid across the street from the White House, and after the caisson bearing the FDR's coffin, there was a limousine with a little man in it, and it was Harry Truman, so he was the first president I saw.
Diane Boyce, did you see President Clinton when he was here with Boris Yeltsin a couple years ago?
Yes, we did. Actually, President Clinton had been here before in February of 1993, shortly after his first inaugural. He came to visit, and then he came back again with President Yeltsin. And some of us were fortunate to see him and talk to him. It's pretty exciting when a seated president comes to a site and you get to see them up close. You're always surprised. I happened to see at Eleanor Roosevelt's funeral Presidents Eisenhower and Truman and Johnson all in the funeral procession. It was quite a treat for a kid in those days.
Mount Lake Terrace, Washington. You're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm June, and I worked as a file clerk in Wheeler Field, whereby all the planes were destroyed, and I was, of course, within a block of a bombing. But my brother was in intelligence, and he was there at the same time. And I always thought it was a blooper that the planes were together. And then I finally had nerve enough to ask him after many, many years why they had so many ships in the harbor that jammed up everything when the practice was not to have the ships in the harbor. And because he would never speak to me in specifics as he was in intelligence. But years later he said, well, President Roosevelt did not want to have even the perception of a first strike from the Americans. And so that was the reason, even though they knew that a sub came into Pearl Harbor and the situation was volatile. And I was wondering if that would be your idea of the first strike that would permit all the bloopers. I don't know what to call them, what I call them mistakes, because I didn't know it for a long time. And of course, my brother being intelligent, he said it was important that all my information came from somebody else and not from him.
Thanks, Professor Kennedy.
We won't give away your secret. Incidentally, you're calling from virtually my hometown, which is Seattle. It was early in the morning out there. Well, look, the biggest fact to remember about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is that it was a surprise. None of the American planners imagined that the Japanese could get a strike force sufficiently large and powerful enough to do the job all the way across the Pacific undetected, all the way out to Hawaii. So it was a tremendous tactical success on the part of the Japanese to get a force that far without having been discovered. All the American military and naval forces in the Pacific were on high alert before December 7th, 1941, but the expectation was that the blow would fall on Singapore, or on the Philippines, or on the Dutch East Indies, or in Indochina, or someplace far westward in the Pacific, not on the Hawaiian Islands.
By the way, we are at Hyde Park. If you've never been to this part of the world, we're not too far away from West Point, which is on the Hudson River. It's on the other side. You can see Albany on your screen and New York City, and it's about a 2-hour drive either by car or by train from New York City up to Hyde Park along the Hudson. It rained all day yesterday, but today the sun is out, and you can see there on the screen a photograph of the FDR Library and Museum. Plenty to see up in this area besides the FDR Library, the Vanderbilt Mansion. Culinary Institute is right down the road where a lot of people like to stop and get a nice meal from the students there. And on your screen is Springwood, the home of FDR and his mother. And our phones are open, and we've got plenty of experts here, including Hugh Gallagher and Diane Boyce. And we're going to go back into this home in a moment and look at the room, the actual room in which FDR was born in, and then the series of bedrooms where he and Eleanor Roosevelt and his mother lived over the number of years. Tucson, Arizona. Go ahead, please.
I spent 1929, the summer, down in Warm Springs with my sister, who was a polio patient, and at that time, everyone called him Roosevelt. Now it's Roosevelt, which is right.
Hugh Gallagher, tell us about Warm Springs, and tell us also about Roosevelt versus Roosevelt.
Well, I've always understood that it was the Theodore Roosevelt side of the family that pronounces it Roosevelt, and that the Roosevelts pronounced it Roosevelt, but I may be wrong.
We have some video on the screen of FDR with his braces on outside.
Yes, and you don't see that very often. This is family photos.
And here he is in the Warm Springs
in the treatment pool, yeah.
Without his braces on.
Without his braces. If you look closely, you can see how he pulls his legs up. He was always very astute about not letting his disability show on camera.
Have you swam in those waters?
Oh, yes. I had treatments in those waters.
Does it do any good?
Oh, it counters gravity so that a weak muscle has more freedom to exercise.
Where did Warm Springs come from?
Oh, it's in Indian Springs, and then it was a resort during the Victorian era. It's a lovely part of Georgia up in the hills, and it was a big old frame Victorian hotel when FDR first came to it.
How often did you go there?
Oh, well, I was there for 9 months, and then I would go back on an annual basis for a checkup.
You should tell our audience that it's open to the public, the Little White House, they call it.
And the Little White House is very impressive because it's so modest. It's simply a small living room, dining room, and then 2 little bedrooms off it, and there you see it.
Now, about how far is that from Atlanta?
Oh, well, nowadays it's about an hour and a half. When I first went, it was by a dirt road all the way, and it took longer.
It's on the east coast of the state of Georgia.
West coast.
I'm sorry, the west coast, yeah.
Closer to Alabama. And it's interesting. He would be there during World War II. He was the commander-in-chief of the largest army in history, and he had one phone line with a long cord. And that's the way he would keep in touch with all the fronts of battle.
And this
modest little bed.
Is this the room he died in?
Yes, it is. That's the wheelchair that he designed. It's just an old kitchen chair. Had the legs taken off and had a blacksmith put wheels on it. And it was very flexible. In his time, wheelchairs were big old raffia wooden things, clunky things. But this little chair that Roosevelt designed could get through narrow doors, and you could put it in the trunk of a car. It was, I think, the first modern functional wheelchair.
Let's go to Tucson, Arizona. Again, go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hello, I'm calling, and during this time, of course, it was the renaissance of American labor, the rise of organized labor. And I'm curious whether your historians could talk a little bit about the relationships that FDR had with John Llewellyn Lewis, Harry Bridges, David Dubinsky, even to a certain extent the Ruth brothers at this time, but especially with Lewis from the standpoint that he was not like today's American labor leader, and often questioned, pushed, and prodded FDR to the max. And also another one that would come into light at this time, A. Philip Randolph, and his threatened march on Washington, and how this affected some of the Rooseveltian policies.
David Kennedy, thank you.
Well, Lewis was a formidable leader in his own right, as you know. In fact, he chose to describe himself not as a labor leader, but as a labor executive, was the term that he cared to use about himself. And you're absolutely right. He put tremendous pressure on Roosevelt to get the New Deal behind the cause of organized labor. And what the cause of organized labor meant at that time was to guarantee government support for labor's right to organize. And indeed, finally, in the so-called Wagner Act, or National Labor Relations Act, 1935, the government did guarantee that right, and that's what kicked off this tremendous round of organizing, especially in the so-called industrial unions, the low-skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled workers in the great industries like steel and automobiles and so on. And it changed the face of organized labor. It changed the terms of life for millions of members of the American working class. It changed the nature of the Democratic Party, as those people became quite indebted to Roosevelt and the Democratic Party for having taken up their cause. Philip Randolph is a slightly different case. As you know, he was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the largest African-American union in the country at the time. And Randolph, at a meeting, a very dramatic meeting at the White House in 1941, insisted that the mobilization effort for World War II, which was beginning to go into second gear at least, if not high gear at that time, that it go forward on a non-racially discriminatory basis, that blacks be given free access to jobs in defense plants. Roosevelt resisted that, and in fact he sent Eleanor Roosevelt to see Philip Randolph to try to dissuade him from bringing this pressure to bear, but Randolph persisted, and eventually FDR issued this executive order guaranteeing no discrimination in defense plants, and that was a tremendous opportunity for African Americans to get out of the South, out of agricultural employment, and get into the defense workforce.
Again, this being the Columbus Day holiday when this show's being done live, a lot of teachers are home, and we want to remind you what the number is if you want to join C-SPAN in the classroom and get materials that would support use of this program in the classroom. 202-626-4858. Folks from our office are in there today on this holiday to take your call, and it's cspan.org/classroom. We'll leave that up for just a moment as we take a call from Hollywood, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
I have several questions on the plate. I was wondering how much involvement Roosevelt had in the Lusitania, being Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and with shipment of arms to Europe during World War I, the packing of the Supreme Court. And can you tell me about State Department policy as Jews were trying to leave Europe and trying to get to the United States? I was watching one program one night about a Jewish family in France that they're delayed by paperwork, where eventually the parents of this person was eventually shipped off to one of the concentration camps, and very soon afterwards his papers came through to get out to the United States. Thank you very much.
Professor Kennedy, he was 31 years old when he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was there for 7 years, and that would have been prior to World War I?
Well, it's actually just about coincident with the outbreak of World War I, just prior to World War I, although well prior to the United States. But the Lusitania affair was mostly a diplomatic affair that Woodrow Wilson and William Jennings Bryan were involved with. And many people thought it was a sufficient occasion for war, that the Germans had sunk this British passenger liner and 100 and some odd American lives were taken. But Wilson refused to go to war. But I'd like to address the caller's other question about the Roosevelt administration and the Holocaust in the 1930s. This remains, as so many items from that era do, a tremendously controversial issue to this day. The fact is that there was a very severely prohibitive statute on the books dated from 1924, an immigration law, which capped the number of immigrants that could come into the country at a relatively low number, about 150,000. And that 150,000 was parceled out to various countries on the basis of the proportion of their people of those nationalities' representation in the 1920 census. So when Hitler began to persecute the Jews inside of Germany and later Austria after the Anschluss, the absorption of Austria in 1938, of course there were lots of Jews trying to leave Europe and get into the United States and indeed other places. In fact, many of them tried to get into Palestine, which the British prohibited. But there were these numeric limits in the law that made it difficult to take more than 20,000 or so per year from Germany and Austria. Again, the Roosevelt administration came under tremendous pressure to change those limits. That would have required congressional action, not just presidential action, to change the statute. And in the midst of a continuing depression with still 14, 15, 16, 17% unemployment, the country wasn't very interested in tremendous increases in the number of immigrants coming in.
White Plains, New York next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, happy Columbus Day, gentlemen.
Welcome.
I have a question, a couple of questions, and I also have a comment. I'm a native of Louisiana. I currently proudly make my home in White Plains, New York, as a result of marrying a wonderful woman from Manhattan. I just recently read a book entitled Huey Long's Louisiana Hayride by Harnett Kane, written in 1941. And after reading that book, I came to the conclusion that had Huey Long not been assassinated and become president, we would have been in one mess, one serious heap of trouble, because the guy was not all there, in my opinion. He wasn't very bright when it came to foreign policy. He was Machiavellian and amoral, essentially. I'd like to know Dr. Kennedy's opinion on FDR's opinion, actually. What he felt FDR's opinion was concerning Huey Long personally, and his feeling as to the threat Huey Long may have posed. Also, I'd like to know what the origins of the Roosevelt family fortune were. Thank you very much.
Well, the last part, the deeper origins of the Roosevelt family fortune were in the shipping business, particularly trade with China in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Well, Roosevelt was very afraid of Long. He was very wary of him. Long was one of the congressional barons from the South, so he needed to work with him in the Congress, but he was quite wary of him. Sarah Roosevelt, the president's mother, called Huey Long that awful man. He had the kind of manners that were not usually on display at patrician estates like this one here along the Hudson River. She just couldn't stomach him. But Roosevelt himself said that he considered Long one of the two most dangerous men in the country. The other, he said, was Douglas MacArthur, who at that time was the Army Chief of Staff. So he was very, very wary of him. He understood the volatility of the country in the 1930s, Roosevelt did, and Long's peculiar ability to appeal to the resentments and anxieties of large parts of the American people in a way that could be deeply disruptive of the political process.
And Boyce, today is Eleanor Roosevelt's birthday, I think?
Yes, it is.
What do you normally do on a day like today?
We normally have a ceremony in the garden, usually around noontime, sometimes 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We have a few remarks made, and we have flowers laid on her grave. She loved yellow roses and yellow mums, and so those are two things that are grown here, and we use those. And just have a ceremony to honor her. We have two other ceremonies during the year as well. We have one for FDR on Memorial Day and one for FDR on his birthday in January.
These pictures on your screen are from the museum, and they have a special room devoted to Eleanor Roosevelt. And on the second floor of the house behind David Kennedy, Bob Riley has a camera there. He's going to show us the birth room. Would you like to explain it to us? What are these series of rooms up there where he was born, and then the rooms where he lived in, and his mother and his wife?
Well, this is the room that FDR was born in on a cold January night. His father wrote in his diary that at 8:45, my Sally had a splendid large baby boy. An odd thing happened. Chloroform had come into use, and Sarah had been put out, and so FDR was also born unconscious and revived by the doctor. We might not all be standing here today.
We're going to take that camera out of that room and then show the audience the three bedrooms. For how long walking down the hallway here, how long did FDR use this bedroom we're going to see?
This is part of the addition to the house in 1915, so he used it from 1915. This is the dressing room first. His bathroom was off this room, and there are some of his clothes in the closet. And then you move in on, these are some of the things. FDR wanted some of his clothes left here, so you could see them when you came to visit. And then this is the bedroom. He liked to spend his mornings here and usually go downstairs around 10 o'clock. He would have breakfast. When he was president, he would meet with his associates. On Christmas morning, the grandchildren were allowed to come in and jump all over his bed. After all, he was a grandfather as well as the President of the United States. And you, magnificent view down the Hudson.
Let me stop right there and ask Hugh Gallagher, when you're in a wheelchair, how difficult is it to do simple things like getting in and out of bed every day?
Well, it depends upon what kind of muscle strength you have. In FDR's case, he could transfer from a wheelchair to a bed using his very strong arms and shoulders. Later in life, in the last years of the presidency, he had an aide who would lift him across.
We go out of this room, right next to it, on your screen here you'll see, as Bob begins to walk down the little aisle, is the bedroom of Eleanor Roosevelt. And how often was she here, Diane Boyce, instead of over at her other home, Valkill?
She always lived at the Roosevelt home as long as the president was alive. If she visited Hyde Park without him, she might often stay at Valkill once it was built after 1925. But of course, before that, she would stay here. During the 20s, she was very active in the Democratic Party and traveling around New York State quite a bit. FDR was at Warm Springs trying to affect the recovery. This had initially been her dressing room. She turned it into the bedroom in order to give him privacy that he would need, because as Mr. Gallagher mentioned, he had to get in and out of the bed and in and out of the furniture in the other room.
And then right next to this room is where his mother stayed, and was she there all the time when they came to visit?
Not always. The chronology we're working on and some of the things that we're working on find that she wasn't always there. It was a house that was open to the whole family, and everybody came and went at various times depending on their schedule. She traveled in Europe. She spent the summers at Campobello. The Roosevelt, Eleanor, and Franklin spent some of the summers at Campobello. So they were coming and going all of the time. And she liked the room because she could look down the driveway to see who might be coming to visit.
Let's go to Washington, D.C. next on the phone for David Kennedy, Hugh Gallagher, Diane Boyce. Go ahead, please.
Yes, first
Hello.
of all, I'd love to. I just love the program, and I thank you so much. I never miss it. And I wanted to ask about, again, another question about FDR's relationship with the Jews and anti-Semitism in the 30s. And how much do you think FDR really was aware of the persecution of the Jews in Europe and Germany?
Thanks, caller. Let me ask Hugh Gallagher to take a shot at that one.
Well, he was getting intelligence reports throughout those years, and on an individual basis, he and Eleanor were able to save a good many of the Jewish refugees. Remember, the country was very isolationist at the time, was very opposed to America interfering or becoming involved with the European war, and he was very limited in how much he could do, as Professor Kennedy has just explained.
Costa Mesa, California, you're next.
I'm reading presently the wartime journals of Charles Lindbergh. I'm getting the feeling that FDR really disliked him as a man, and some of the fireside chats I know insinuated his Lindbergh's views, but didn't name him personally. I was just wondering, did he really dislike him as a man, or just his views? Thank you.
David Kennedy.
Well, he certainly disliked his views, and Roosevelt's on the record as having once said to one of his aides, I think it was Harold Ickes, he said, "I want you to know, should I die tomorrow, that I believe that Charles Lindbergh is a fascist, is a Nazi, pardon me." Well, I don't think Lindbergh was a Nazi, but Lindbergh certainly represented among the most prominent spokespersons for the great idea that Roosevelt was trying to beat down, which is what Hugh Gallagher just mentioned, isolationism. Lindbergh was conspicuous in the effort to try to keep the United States from putting any of its weight whatsoever in the scales in the fight against Nazi Germany. That bred a deep antagonism between the two men.
Stallion Springs, California. Go ahead, please.
Brian Lamb, thank you very much for the program. Dr. Kennedy,
there's a couple of acronyms that haven't been talked about yet. One is the NRA, and the other CCC, and is it WPA or PWA?
There's both, actually.
Okay, could you kind of expound on those a little bit?
Well, each of them in its own way was designed to overcome the Depression, to provide employment or to stabilize prices or to cut production, impose production quotas so there wouldn't be overproduction that would depress prices. The NRA, of course, the National Recovery Administration, only lasted 2 years. It was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1935. WPA comes into being in 1935, the Works Progress Administration, to provide, it turned out later, cumulatively, to be millions of jobs for unemployed people. PWA, Public Works Administration, same thing, big public works projects designed to provide employment. My own father worked on a PWA project at Grand Coulee Dam in 1938, for example. CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, was one of the earliest and most popular of the New Deal programs to provide employment for young men, mostly in the timber and forest industries, to get them out of the city into the countryside, provide them jobs that would give a little bit of income to them and their families.
Riverside, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Brian. I have two observations that I'd like to share and hear your comments regarding them. One, FDR's relationship with J. Edgar Hoover. There was a story that Mr. Hoover came into some letters that were supposedly written between Eleanor and another woman, and they were quite intimate and may lead one to believe that their relationship was more than just cerebral. And Mr. Hoover inquired if he should continue an investigation, and reportedly the president told him that he should stop, and anyone involved, if there was a pursuing, that any agent involved in this investigation, the president would draft them and send them to the war in the Pacific until they were all killed. I'm curious if there's any truth to that. Also, with General MacArthur and the president's meeting with Nimitz in Hawaii to discuss the perhaps invasion of the Philippines, Douglas wanted to leave immediately preceding his presentation, and with the comment that he believed that the commander's place with his troops at the front, and FDR smiled and said, "Yes, Douglas, that's precisely why I'm here." Anyway, any comment on those two? Thank you.
Let's start with Hugh Gallagher. Any of those you want to pick up on?
Yes, MacArthur said to his aides that he thought it was a waste of time to go to Hawaii and meet with the president. But the president, as always, managed to seduce MacArthur and managed to obtain MacArthur's agreement on an overall Pacific strategy. So it was a very useful meeting.
Hugh Gallagher, let me ask you about another subject that he brought up about having relations with women. Because you've been in this condition, I want to ask you a delicate question. From what you know of someone having polio and being in a wheelchair, can a man
yes,
have sexual relations?
A man can, yes. Whether, in fact, Roosevelt did is another question. He was raised by his mother, who was a high Victorian woman with very high standards. Roosevelt was a gossip. He was a flirt. Whether or not he actually had affairs with Missy LeHand or Lucy Mercer Rutherford, we have no way of knowing.
On the screen is in a study, and it was in that study, I believe, Diane Boyce, weren't there a couple of fireside chats from that room?
That's the library study. There was one from there, there was one from the home, and the rest were from what is now the diplomatic reception room at the White House.
How many were there, David Kennedy? Do you remember?
I don't know the exact number. I want to say 40 some odd, but I'm not sure that's correct.
You know, Diane, Hugh Gallagher, you know?
They're between about 28 and 34. It depends on who's counting. And there weren't as many as people think they were. They think they were all the time, all of the years that he was president, but that was not the case. They dwindled out as the war progressed. He didn't do as many. They were a lot initially because of the Depression and the conditions under which he assumed office.
Yeah, the fact is that whatever the number, they were a revolutionary use of radio, and they contributed to a revolutionary relationship of the presidency to the public.
Hugh Gallagher? I remember these fireside chats when I was a boy. And if you were in a movie theater, they would stop the movie and play the radio broadcast from the White House. Everyone in the nation listened.
If you've just joined us, we are at the Hyde Park home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And where are people? Hugh Gallagher is over in the museum area. That on your screen right there is the house. That's the museum. And Diane Boyce is off to my right, over here right near the gravesite with the home in the background, wearing her Smokey the Bear hat. How many years again have you been here?
18.
When's that book coming out on Sarah Delano
It's going to
Roosevelt?
be a little while longer. There's a lot of research. It's sort of like giving up something. Both Mr. Gallagher and Dr. Kennedy might know what that was a little bit like, since they've done books and published them. It's sort of hard to give it up. But
And David Kennedy's book is Freedom from Fear, and it's how many? 900 pages?
858 pages of text.
And been out since when?
Since last May.
South Bend, Indiana, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just had two comments on Franklin Roosevelt. My name's Rod Spickler from South Bend, Indiana. My father and grandfather both told me that FDR gave the people that intangible thing, hope, and self-worth through such programs as the WPA. I mean, it wasn't a handout. You worked for what you got. And secondly, I laugh at these Republican conservatives today who denounce FDR while they gleefully cash their Social Security checks.
David Kennedy?
Well, you're absolutely right about WPA. It was artfully contrived to provide work, not just a handout. In fact, there's plenty of documentation of people at the time saying, we're not on welfare anymore, we're working for the government, meaning they had a WPA job. So it was psychologically, it seems to me, quite shrewd and quite well done to give people that sense.
Middletown, hold on just a second, Hugh Gallagher. I want to take a call from Middletown, Ohio. You're next.
Yes,
Hello?
I was. I grew up in the early '40s, and my dad got me interested in collecting stamps. And I could collect stamps along with the president, and I still have my collection. And I was just concerned about what happened to his collection. Is it still there on the grounds, or do you know anything about that?
Diane Boyce?
His stamp collection.
the stamp collection, unfortunately, was sold off, which was FDR's wish to keep it together. There were 150 matched albums that had been started by his mother when she was a little girl. And there are a few of them back in the library. The library staff could address that. But unfortunately, it wasn't all kept.
We want to let you listen in on a brief 43 seconds of a fireside chat. This is from March the 12th, 1933. By the way, I know I've found it in a bookstore. You can buy the fireside chats, all written out. Let's listen to this, and we'll get some quick comment and get back to our phones.
After all, there is an element in the readjustment of our financial system more important than currency, more important than gold, and that is the confidence of the people themselves. Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
Hugh Gallagher, do you remember how long they were?
They were not long. They were maybe 15 minutes. But he had a way of talking to you so that you felt as though he were in the room. And for most Americans, over 12 years, FDR became a member of the family.
Next call, Desert Hot Springs, California. Hello.
Good morning.
Hi.
My name is Margaret Smith. I live in Desert Hot Springs, California. Lived in New Jersey for 50 years. My husband and I, between us, were government employees for 50 years, civilian employees. All my life I've heard about Franklin Roosevelt. He was the only president I knew for the early part of my life. My question is, I've heard about Eleanor and I've heard about his mother. What about his father? I know biologically he had to have a father, but until just about 20 minutes ago on your program, I never heard about his father.
Thanks. Diane Boyce?
James Roosevelt, Franklin's father, actually had been married before. His first wife, Rebecca Howland, he and his first wife, Rebecca Howland, had a son who they had named James Roosevelt, nicknamed Rosie, lived right next door, right on the other side of this house. He lived until he was 72 years of age. He died of heart disease. But many of the things that FDR learned here as a little boy at his father's knee, riding around on the property every day and visiting all of the staff who worked here, are things that were translated into many of his programs as governor and as president of the United States. His mother said the first 8 years of his life, his father had been a very active man, although he was much older than his wife. When Sarah and James were married, Sarah was 26 and James was 52.
Next call, New York City. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, you're on the air.
I live in East Greenbush, New York, which is about an hour from the house where Roosevelt grew up. I was a teenager when Roosevelt was president, and I was chosen by Rensselaer County, 4-H, to serve tea and cakes to the president and his wife when they came to the New York State Fair, which was held at Syracuse, New York. Those who lived during the Depression, it was a different kind of a world. You didn't know where your money was coming from, but the president and his wife were interested in the young people.
Okay, we'll leave it at that because we have, it just happens that we have a young person on the line right now who is Todd Spivak at the Franklin D. Roosevelt High School here in Hyde Park. We always talk to a student. Mr. Spivak, good morning.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
What year are you in school?
I'm a junior at Franklin D. Roosevelt High School.
How big's your school?
Its student population is 1,300.
How much do you know about FDR?
I came to know primarily about Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, in the 7th grade, where I took a program for the gifted and talented, which was entitled the Roosevelt Seminar. And at this seminar, we learned the social history of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and we also took trips to Roosevelt-related sites such as Museum, Falkill, and the home that was intended to be the president's retirement home, which was called Top Cottage, which is also in Hyde Park. And the seminar taught us to become historical researchers, and we conducted first-hand research about the Roosevelts. I've been throughout my life, I've been interested in Roosevelt because I live in his hometown, and that's been an impetus for me to continue to study the president and all the Roosevelts and also the Hudson River friendships.
I understand you know something about FDR's involvement in the local community.
Yeah, actually, I know Roosevelt, he was a member of the fire department, and he was also the official Hyde Park historian.
And we also have another official Hyde Park historian, I think, standing on the grounds here. Is that right, Diane Boyce?
I'm the former town historian. I did it for 10 years. FDR did it back in the 1920s. He loved local history, was very interested in it, and was one of the things that he did to occupy his time when he was recouping from the polio was to go through and write some local history, collect local records. A lot of them are in the library next door. He really was very proud of his hometown. He liked the Dutch architecture. He contributed a great deal to it, and it was great fun for him and relaxation.
I understand, Todd Spivak, you might have a question for Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah, my question is that because Roosevelt established Social Security and that obviously it's in virtually peril today, what would you think that his reaction to the financial problems that Social Security faces today would be, and how do you think that the president would look to solve these problems?
Well, he envisioned originally a system even more ambitious than the one we have. His original conception of the Social Security Act was that it should also include universal health insurance. Now, that's something that's fallen by the wayside. Various presidents, Lyndon Johnson, Bill Clinton, have tried to bring back into the system in some way. So I think Roosevelt considers Social Security his greatest domestic achievement, and he would be very, very nervous about proposals today to privatize it, and probably would be looking for ways to expand it and make it even more secure.
Todd Spivak, last question for you. What do you intend to do after high school?
Well, actually, it's ironic because I'm fascinated with history. However, I also fascinated with technology. So I envision myself in a computer-related field, and I think I'll be continuing to study history, probably as more of a hobby and something just to do and to be interested in, rather than as a career goal. But however, I'm not going to rule that out because I believe I'm still young to decide concretely what my career goals should be.
I've got just the university for you to attend at Stanford, where we have both great technology and great history.
Thanks, Todd Spivak, for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And he goes to a high school named after the president. We're talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt High School right here in Hyde Park. And while we're here, let's stop again and give you the telephone number for teachers. Teachers that might be home today because of the Columbus Day holiday, 202-626-4858. Call our folks back in the Education Department, John Wheeler and her group. They're there to take your calls this morning, to sign you up free of charge, no cost. No, we're not going to come back at you and ask you for money someday or ask you for anything. This is material that you can use in the classroom. Hopefully you can use these tapes as you go along. But for the moment, we're going to go back to the phones for our three guests here. We go to Seabrook Island, South Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning.
What would you like to say, sir?
Oh, I had an interesting experience when I was 10 years old with President Roosevelt. My hometown was Clarksburg, West Virginia, and this was just 2 days before the November 44 election. And Roosevelt was on the train, the B&O Railroad, passing through West Virginia, and had pre-announced that he was going to make a stop in my hometown of Clarksburg. So this was Sunday morning around 11 o'clock. I went with my parents and was fortunate enough that when the caboose car stopped, I was right next to it, so I was able to almost touch him. Was right below the railings. So the president came out and stood at the rail, and the amazing thing, and if I live to be 100, I'll never forget it, he didn't once say anything about the election, which was going to be held just 2 days from then. His only remarks were how lucky we were to get to live in such a beautiful state. He said he had been looking out the train windows. He was passing through West Virginia from the Ohio Valley over in Parkersburg on his way through West Virginia to Washington, and never once said anything about the election 2 days later. So probably in the entire history of presidential campaigns, no candidate who was standing for election just 2 days would have missed an opportunity like he did to ask for our vote.
All right, callers, thank you very much for your story, and I want to use that as a way to get, and any of our guests can jump in here on this. I wrote down this morning, David Kennedy, the numbers on the 4 elections, the only man in history to be elected 4 times. The first election, he got 22,800,000 votes, and Herbert Hoover got 15,700,000. In 36, FDR got 27,400,000, and Alf Landon 16,600,000, the worst defeat ever of a Republican. In 40, FDR got 27 million, and Wendell Willkie, famous Hoosier, 22 million. And then in 44, FDR got 25 million. He actually lost a couple million votes. And Tom Dewey got 22 million. What's that? In the electoral vote, the lowest ever was Alf Landon, got 8 electoral votes in 36. What do all those numbers say to you? Hugh Gallagher, you can jump in here too, Mr. Kennedy.
Well, to go back, first of all, the 32 election, I think he won because he was anybody but Hoover. He wins in 36 because he's been triumphant in legislating the New Deal and keeping the country together and at least making some headway against the Depression. 1940, most historians have looked at the election of 1940, think that he may well have lost that election had it not been for the international crisis. The election came in this country just a few months after France had fallen to the Nazis, and the opinion seemed to be that in this great period of great international uncertainty, we'd better stick with a proven leader.
Hugh Gallagher, how many years did you work in the Senate?
I worked in the Senate for 10 years.
You know, I've got here back in the 75th Congress in 1937, the Democrats had 75 senators. The Republicans
Wouldn't that be sweet?
The Republicans had 17. Republicans had 17. In the House, they had 333 members of the House and only 89 Republicans. What would that have been like, do you think? And is it healthy?
Well, he was doing just fine until he got to the Supreme Court packing. And then he managed to alienate a good many of the Southern conservative chairmen of committees.
This was 37.
Yeah, and he also tried to purge the Democratic Party of its more conservative members. And I remember reading that the senator came up to Senator George and said, FDR is his own worst enemy. And Senator George said, not so long as I'm alive.
Now, in the court packing plan that he had lost 70 to 20 in the United States Senate when he had an overwhelming majority.
Yes.
What was the plan?
The plan was to add additional members to the court so that the New Deal programs would not be struck down by the court. But nature took its course, and the old Supreme Court justices began retiring, and Roosevelt was able to appoint enough judges so that the New Deal programs were safe.
There's some artwork from the museum on that issue. Let me grab this call from White Plains, New York. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hi, Mr. Lamb. I love your show.
Thank you.
My question is for Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah.
Could you tell me how the CIA was actually developed by FDR? I read somewhere that the British Secret Service, along with Churchill and Lord Stevenson, actually gave us the technology and the know-how that gave birth to the CIA. And I wasn't sure about that. I'll hang up.
The CIA is actually formed after World War II. Its predecessor is a wartime body called the OSS, which was an intelligence service, but the CIA proper is a post-World War II creation.
Want to add anything, Hugh Gallagher?
Yeah, under Herbert Hoover, Stimson, who was Secretary of State, said a gentleman doesn't read another gentleman's mail. So we were very naive about intelligence as we entered World War II.
Next call, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Last, before we take a couple-minute break, and we'll continue this program on the 32nd President. Go ahead, sir.
Good morning. I've got a question for, I guess, David Kennedy, if he's read The Roosevelt Myth by John Flynn and The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor by Rear Admiral Theobald, and if he has a comment on that.
I know those books, and in fact, I disagree with them rather strenuously. Again, to repeat something we were talking about earlier, nobody in either Britain or the United States wanted a war with Japan. That, to paraphrase a statement made about the Korean War later, in 1941, a war with Japan was the wrong war at the wrong time, in the wrong place, with the wrong enemy. The strategic enemy was Germany. The object of American and British diplomacy was to avoid war with Japan. It was not very artful diplomacy, as it turned out, and the Japanese eventually provoked or started the war. But the idea that Roosevelt deliberately tried to coax the Japanese or goad the Japanese into an attack in order to get the United States in the war is an idea that simply will not bear close examination.
We're at Hyde Park, a place where FDR lived a lot of his life. His father died at age 72 in the 1900. Diane Boyce, correct me if these numbers sound wrong to you. My own arithmetic. His mother died when she was 86 in the year 1941.
Yep.
Was he an only child?
Yes, he was an only child. His father had had the other son, Rosie, by his first marriage. So FDR had an older half-brother.
How many children did he have?
How many children did
FDR have?
FDR and Eleanor actually had 6. They had 1 daughter and 5 sons. 1 son died in infancy. The children are all deceased today, and there are 25 grandchildren and 52 great-grandchildren and even a few great-great-grandchildren alive.
How many of his sons fought in World War II?
They all fought in World War II.
Any of them wounded or?
No. James was in the Marine Corps. Elliott Roosevelt was in the old Army Air Corps. And John and Franklin Jr. were in the Navy, and they all saw active combat.
I want to thank Mark Farkas, who is our executive producer. He's here with us today and in charge of all these programs. We've got a lot more to come, another hour and a half. We're going to take a break for a couple of minutes, and what you're going to see here is a clip, a video clip, as we call them, from the 1933 inaugural address.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days. In such a spirit on my part and on yours, we face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things. Values have shrunk to fantastic levels. Taxes have risen. Our ability to pay has fallen. Government of all kinds is faced by serious curtailment of income. The means of exchange are frozen in the currents of trade. The withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side. Farmers find no market for their produce, and the savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment.
We'll have money in our jeans.
Welcome back to Hyde Park as we continue our program on the 32nd President of the United States. The man there on the screen, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's in the museum. Anyone can visit this place 7 days a week. That's the presidential desk from the Oval Office for the little more than 12 years that FDR was president. Elected 4 different times by wide margins, both electoral votes and popular votes. Had an opportunity during those 4 terms to appoint some 9 members of the Supreme Court. That's the Springwood home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where he lived. Eleanor Roosevelt lived there and her children, also his mother, Sarah Roosevelt, up until 1941. A lot of visitors here on this Columbus Day holiday, and I have in my hand, actually, here on the set, a hat I was just handed that says USS Roosevelt on it, and it's a brand new ship from the Navy. And the folks from the Navy, it's going to be commissioned in October. It's named as first ship ever named after 2 people, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. It's a DDG-80 being constructed down in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And folks from this ship that are going to be on this ship are going to be at the ceremony for Eleanor Roosevelt on her birthday, which is behind us at the gravesite, which we'll look at a little bit later. We have some calls waiting, and we're going to go right back to the phones. Next call is from Springfield, New Jersey. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hi, my name is Pamela Bookbinder, and I had a question for you. I was wondering what you thought was the most influential thing FDR did during his terms as president.
Thanks. Hugh Gallagher, what do you think is the most influential thing?
He raised the spirit and confidence of the country. My mother, I remember my mother telling me that the inaugural address in 1933 was like the difference between night and day. His confidence, his ebullience, his good cheer, his concern for people made it a different country, and I think that was his greatest contribution.
David Kennedy?
Well, I think Hugh Gallagher has put his finger on something that's intangible, hard to capture in the history books, but I think quite important. It's just that spiritual lift that Roosevelt gave to the country. In a somewhat more concrete vein, I might say that maybe his most decisive moment was 1940, 1941, when Hitler had overrun Europe, when only Britain and then later the Soviet Union remained as Hitler's adversaries, and when many people predicted that Britain and Russia would both go down, and Roosevelt virtually alone concluded that it was worth placing a wager on the British and then on the Russians and keeping them in the war, supporting them, carrying the battle to Hitler, and that was a decisive moment in history, and I think he gets an awful lot of credit for that very lonely decision.
Hartford, Connecticut, you're next. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Brian. I'm a transplanted New Yorker, and the first thing I need to remind you is that you can't get to Hyde Park from Pennsylvania Station. You have to start at Grand Central Station in New York City, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, you can get on the Amtrak out of, I believe, out of...
Well, you can make a connection from Penn Station to Grand Central and then get on Amtrak from Grand Central. But the reason I called is because when I was a little girl, I grew up in a Republican household, and I didn't know that Roosevelt had been president until I was an adult. My mother and father were anti-union. They were staunch believers in the ability of the individual to do for themselves, and I became the first card-carrying union member in my family because of that. I'm a Democrat now, and I believe in what Roosevelt believed in, but I've always wondered, or I was wondering if your guests could comment on how Roosevelt really was a lightning rod for the cleavages between the Republican idea of people doing for themselves and the so-called Democrat idea of the government taking care of people.
Thank you. David Kennedy?
Well, sure. I mean, he was controversial in his time, as he has been ever since. In many Republican households, he was referred to simply as that man. You weren't allowed to pronounce his name. There's a famous cartoon in the New Yorker that shows a group of people all dressed up in tuxedos and high hats and so on, clearly upper crust people. And they're saying to another crowd of similarly dressed people, you want to join us? We're going down to the movie theater to hiss Roosevelt. So in certain sectors of the society, sure, he excited those kinds of passions and hatreds, but the fact is that for the great majority of Americans who elected him and re-elected him those 4 times, as Brian has reminded us, he was a champion and a hero.
Hugh Gallagher, we're going to later on in the archives see the diary, mega volume diary of Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. What kind of a leader was he?
He was a strong leader. He was a neighbor up here in Hyde Park. Roosevelt had known him all his life and had great confidence in him. During the war, he took a very anti-German position and was noted for wanting Germany to be turned into pasture land and farming, but saner heads prevailed.
Riverhead, New York, next. Hello. Riverhead, New York, you're on the air. Speak up, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Hi.
This question is directed for Professor Kennedy. I was wondering if he could go into some details as to the problem that FDR had in signing the anti-lynching law in the late 30s. Southern chairmen seemed to be wielding a great amount of power, and FDR was very reluctant to take them on, and Eleanor's input in that process.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, Eleanor, as you quite rightly say, was a great champion of the cause of African Americans in the 30s and beyond. And she urged Roosevelt, as did many others, to support this law, which passed the House of Representatives and then moved to the Senate. It resembled, actually, in many ways, the later 1964 Civil Rights Law, in that it authorized federal law enforcement officers to go into the South and prosecute people accused of racial crimes, lynching crimes especially. The Senate blocked the bill. Roosevelt refused to use presidential influence to move it through the Senate. And as he explained repeatedly to the people that came and beseeched him to behave differently about this, he said he just simply could not afford to alienate these powerful committee chairmen, most of them Southern Democrats, who would part company with him if he provoked the racial issue. So it was a moment in American history when a lot of people thought there were so many reforms happening. It was also time to take on the race question, but Roosevelt's considered judgment, whatever his private feelings about race, his considered opinion was that the political situation simply would not permit it.
David Kennedy teaches at Stanford University and has a freshman seminar this semester where he's teaching the history, American history through literature.
That's right.
Hugh Gallagher has a book out called FDR's Splendid Deception, worked in the United States Senate for a couple of, I guess, 10 years. For which senators?
Senator John Carroll of Colorado, the citizen's friend, and Senator Bob Bartlett of Alaska, the founder of Alaska statehood.
Tucson, Arizona, you're next.
Good morning.
Hello. Hi.
I'm delighted to be getting through here. My first vote as a young woman, first time voting in the electoral election in 1932, it was my privilege to vote against Franklin D. Roosevelt. I did it because he had promised to return drinking beer and liquor and all such things. In other words, to repeal prohibition. And I was a very strong Kansan, being born and raised in the same county where Carrie Nation started her activities. And I was severely reprimanded by one of my neighbors because I had left the party of my father in order to, not really in order to vote, for the Republican candidate, who said that I shouldn't do that. I said the only man, she thought I'd done it for my husband. I said the only man who influenced me was the man that was running for president and planned to repeal the prohibition. Then later, I saw what he did to the honest farmers when he had farmers paid to put their poor land, their arroyos and their gravel pits into the soil bank and make more money than they had ever made before in their lives. Also, from 1950 until 1977, I lived off and on in Japan. I spoke Japanese very fluently, and I was acquainted personally with at least 3 people who lived in Japan prior to the war and spoke Japanese as fluently as any native and were able to read the newspapers in Japanese. They knew about the things that were going on there, and they tried to get an audience with Franklin D. Roosevelt, even at the early hours of when the attack was about to come. They tried and tried to get his attention. They tried and tried to get an audience with him, and they were not allowed to come in to talk with him, and he went on making his deals. The Japanese men were trying and trying to get an audience so that they might reach some kind of a decision before the attack was made.
Thanks for calling today. And Mr. Kennedy, what are you hearing there?
Well, actually, I'd like to comment on the prohibition business because you're absolutely right that Roosevelt publicly declared that he would work to end the prohibition experiment of the 1920s, and he did. There was a certain revenue logic to that. The federal government needed the revenue from the sale of alcoholic drinks, but more to the point, I think Roosevelt and the Democratic Party wanted to build a bridge or strengthen a bridge to those immigrant communities that had come into the country in the late 19th, early 20th century, who were by and large wet, who were anti-prohibition. And in fact, one of the great changes that comes about in the American political scene in the 1920s is that those immigrant communities move en masse into the Democratic Party and form a durable majority for virtually a generation.
Hugh Gallagher, my figures are correct here. On December the 5th, 1933, the prohibition was repealed. Do you remember those times?
No, I don't. But during the great 100 days when Roosevelt first entered office, so many of the major New Deal programs were passed by the Congress, one after the other after the other. And after about 100 days, FDR said, now it's time for beer. and he sent up a bill asking that beer be legalized, and it was passed overwhelmingly.
How many years was this country not allowed to drink?
Oh, David, was it 1919?
1920 to 1933.
Yeah, 20 till 33.
We have a call waiting in San Jose, California. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Brian. I'm calling from San Jose. Like your show very much. In your past shows, you've visited the national monuments and memorials of many of the presidents, and I was wondering if you were going to have the opportunity to visit the FDR National Monument in Washington, D.C. Wanted to see if you were going to have any coverage on that, and if there were any comments by your historians as far as is that a controversial monument with the artwork, or?
We have visited it. You can see a video on your screen right now. It's a $54 million project. And Hugh Gallagher, those who have just joined us do not know you're sitting in a wheelchair, but you, I think, you were involved in all this and the controversy?
Yes.
What was it?
I am on the committee that has commissioned a statue, and the Congress, as we speak, is having a conference committee on allocating the money to prepare the groundwork for the placement of the statue of FDR in a wheelchair.
Should there have been one in this monument from the start?
Oh, yes. There should have been some acknowledgement that FDR was a paraplegic. He's become the hero of the disability rights movement, not just here, but throughout the world. And it's very important that it be done.
Where's the statue going to go?
It's going to go right at the entrance to the right, on the right-hand side of the plaza. It'll be a life-size statue of the man. He will be wearing a sweater, and he'll be sitting in a wheelchair, and behind him you'll see the great memorial of what this man achieved. It will be flush on the ground, so that walking people perhaps will bump into it, won't see it. Handicapped people, people in wheelchairs, will be able to sit beside it and have their pictures taken. And I think it really will become an important part of the memorial. The memorial has a timeline with the 4 terms, and our statue will show Franklin Roosevelt as the private individual.
Greenbelt, Maryland, you're next.
Yeah, Brian, I wanted to call. I listened to Dr. Kennedy. I guess it's Dr. Kennedy and Mr. Gallagher, well, especially Dr. Kennedy, talk about his views on racial relations as it relates to the lynching laws and things of that nature. And I look at the Japanese-American situation. I view this guy as one of the biggest racists of any president we ever had. Anybody who would incarcerate an entire race of people. I know it was during war, but I thought there was no excuse for that. And you being from Indiana and knowing Wendell Willkie, or knowing of Wendell Willkie, he was totally against racism. But these days, the Republicans are seen as the racist party. You know, Willkie fought against the Ku Klux Klan. That's how he became so popular in Indiana, fighting against the Ku Klux Klan. Not to rehash that thing, but I just thought it was unusual that these guys stick up for Roosevelt, you know, when he did all these things that I view as racist, especially incarcerating a race of people during World War II.
Thanks, Greenbelt. Professor Kennedy?
Well, with all respect, I think the claim that Roosevelt was one of the greatest racist presidents of all time is, to put it charitably, vastly overblown. That said, you're absolutely right that the business of incarcerating those 120,000 or so Japanese Americans during World War II was a moral and a constitutional travesty. There were many people inside the Roosevelt administration who were nervous about that from the beginning, not least of all the Attorney General, Francis Biddle. The decision was taken without much thought. Actually, it was rather casually taken on the argument that it was militarily necessary, and Roosevelt himself seems to have given very little attention to the matter. There's not much in the record that suggests that.
Hugh Gallagher?
I remember those days, and the nation was in panic. We had lost our Pacific Fleet in one bomb attack. We thought the Japanese were going to bomb the West Coast. Japanese submarines had fired on the West Coast. It was an injustice, but it was taken at a time of great panic, and perhaps that exonerates it a bit.
In the same building where Hugh Gallagher is, which is the museum and library, Ray Teichman, who has been at this archives for some 28 years, is in the stacks. Mr. Teichman, tell us what this area is all about.
Well, this is the first of the presidential libraries, which form a system now that covers every president from Hoover up through President Bush. And it was Roosevelt's idea to put this institution together. He himself, of course, had been in public life into the 30s now, since about 1910, when he first served in New York. He was also a great collector. He loved the United States Navy and collected a great volume of books and memorabilia about the Navy. He was also very interested in the history of this county, Dutchess County, and going all the way back to the Revolution. He collected the standard works. He had these tremendous collections and these papers. His mother had kept memorabilia going back to his childhood and held on to everything. And he really needed a place to put these things, and he thought of it in terms of a great legacy for the American people, that he would be the first president to think in terms of leaving the papers of his administrations and of his life to the public. And along with the collections, he also hoped that other friends of his and other members of his administration would place their papers here, and they did so. So we've amassed a tremendous collection of records amounting to about 17 million pages of manuscript material, over 300 collections, and in addition, of course, the objects that come down to us from the presidency and from his life prior to the presidency, which are on exhibit in the museum. And he hoped that the museum would serve to educate the public about the presidency, particularly his, of course. But so this is essentially what we have and what we're about.
Let me ask Hugh Gallagher and David Kennedy, just very quickly, did you use this library at all in your book?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, it's a tremendous resource, this library. Yeah, it's one of the great presidential libraries anywhere.
And Hugh Gallagher, how did you use it?
I used it in writing Splendid Deception, and their photo archives are absolutely remarkable. And the interesting thing about this president library is that it's a very friendly place, and the staff and the curators are very helpful, and it's very cheerful.
Ray Teichman, are you a federal employee?
Yes, we are. We're employees ultimately of the National Archives and Records Administration, and which, of course, as I said before, administers all of the presidential libraries, as well as some 10, 11 federal record centers and the main archival institutions in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland.
Are you there? And I ask this question because you see it written from time to time that presidential libraries favor their president. Are you there as a representative of the public, American people, or the representative of the family?
We're there as a representative of the American people, of the public. The object of my job specifically is to preserve the papers that have been left here by the president and by his contemporaries, and to make them available to people like Dr. Kennedy, who are doing research on the life and times of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt.
I want, at some point in the next few minutes, I want you to show us the Henry Morgenthau papers.
Be glad to.
But first, we have a couple calls, actually from the same city, stacked up. Springfield, New Jersey. You're next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, yeah, this is Lauren Bell.
Hello? Let's try again. Let's do another Springfield, New Jersey call. Go ahead, please. I've lost the phones. Can we get a call up? Hello? Let's go back to Ray Teichman. I don't know what happened to our phones, but we lost them both in Springfield. I have a feeling it were the students, again, that we're watching out there this morning. Ray Teichman, you said how many different people have papers in this archive?
Well, we have over 300 collections. Some of the major figures in the administration, as you've mentioned already, Henry Morgenthau, who was Secretary of Treasury from 1934 until actually into the beginning of the Truman administration in 1945. We have the papers of Harry Hopkins, who was a key figure in the public relief programs of the 1930s, particularly the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and then later became a key advisor to Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, particularly during the phases in 1941 and 42, when when Harry was kind of the key link between the White House and the British and later the Russians.
Let's try this call now from Shrewsbury, Pennsylvania. Go ahead, please. Pennsylvania, are you there? We seem to be having phone problems. Let's go to a camera that we have out on the lawn, if we can see that, showing you this house is very near the Hudson River. You can't see it much from where this camera is located. It's right over the hills there, right over the trees. Still very green here. It's this October. It's 11th, I guess it is. The trees are starting to turn a little bit. The tree behind David Kennedy is. And there you can see on the screen Springwood, the home of FDR. Bedrooms up there on the second floor. And we are off to the right there in the trees, and that's from the other side of the house. If you come here to visit, you walk in that front door there and can visit the home and also the library. Ray Teichman, do you have that? What do you have in your hand? Do you have some documents there?
I have a few documents here. You mentioned Henry Morgenthau, and I have one of the Morgenthau diaries. The diaries consist of over 865 volumes. They're not diaries in the accepted sense of someone making an entry every day. Rather, they're a compilation of the official records of his office.
Where are they in location from where you're standing?
Actually, they're right next to me.
Can we just show the audience what they look like? How many actual volumes are they?
I said there are 865.
They're right off to the left there? I don't know that our camera can
Well, they're off to my right, your left. And
for how many years?
I think he's got a very section. They start when Henry was with the Farm Credit Administration in 1933. Then he became Secretary of the Treasury. So they cover roughly 1934 into 1945.
And you were going to show us one there on the table?
I have one here on the table, which has a very interesting document, I think, because it shows a telephone conversation, the transcription of a telephone conversation, in this case between Henry Morgenthau and our ambassador to Great Britain, a gentleman by the name of Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and of course the current senator from Massachusetts.
Is there anything else in your archive as extensive as this?
Outside of the papers of the president, and of course Eleanor's papers, no, I think this is probably one of the great documents that the nation is privileged to own, because it just shows on a daily basis one of the major offices of the cabinet, and certainly a man who had a great deal of influence on Roosevelt and on the country's foreign policy.
Let me go back to the phones. We'll try one more time. Alpharetta, Georgia, you're on the air. Alpharetta, Georgia, you're on the air.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Please go ahead.
Yes, Brian, I very much enjoy this series. My question is compound. Number one, I would like to know what the president thought about Chamberlain, and number two, give us some background as to the appointment of Kennedy to the Court of St. James and what brought on the resignation, etc., and what the president personally thought about Kennedy as a politician, etc., and how that played into us.
David Kennedy.
Well, you know, an equally interesting question is what Chamberlain thought about Roosevelt. Because Chamberlain tried repeatedly to get Roosevelt to commit himself, get the United States to commit itself to some better relationship with Britain in their war against Germany. And it was Roosevelt who proved unable to bring his country around, at least during Chamberlain's prime ministry. So the two men were quite frustrated with one another, I'd say. As for Joseph P. Kennedy, he was an arch-isolationist in the sense that he thought Britain could not survive and the United States, therefore, should not pour any resources into the United Kingdom in 1940-41. So he, too, was very much at loggerheads with Roosevelt, who had a very different opinion.
Fraser Park, California, you're next.
Here I am. My name is Jim Kennedy. I'm not related to any of the people on this particular program, and I have a particular bone to pick with Mr. Kennedy on a book that I believe he wrote. And the title I can't quite remember, but the premise is that nations who engage in military buildups usually falter somewhere down the line as a result of these particular buildups. I happen to be an ex-Marine, among other things, and one of the intangibles of a nation is that you cannot measure the amount of good citizens or good citizenry in any kind of statistical analysis, because what you are is you are a product of that your military experience, and in doing so, you have brought to bear. You have become a better citizen, which cannot, in fact, be put in any kind of statistical analysis. That's one. Two, I had two grandfathers, and one of them thought that Franklin D. Roosevelt walked on water. He was the second coming. The other one would fly off into a tirade whenever the name Franklin D. Roosevelt was mentioned. I think, and thought he was the Antichrist, quite frankly. I think Franklin D. Roosevelt falls somewhere in between those two erratic statements. One other thing that I would like to point out is that during the Second World War, all of Franklin D. Roosevelt's children served in the military, and some of them distinguished themselves in that military, as did George Marshall, who lost a stepson. Harry Hopkins lost a son in the Second World War, which is a measure of the men involved, as far as I'm concerned. The current occupant of the White House obviously didn't serve anywhere. In fact, took great pains to in fact evade military service.
I'm going to let you go, caller, because we've heard a lot from you, and I want Mr. Kennedy to have a chance to respond.
Well, first of all, let me just say this is a case of mistaken identity. The Kennedy whose book you read that you want to argue with is Paul Kennedy, who actually is a professor of history at Yale. So you better take up that matter with him. But his basic argument, actually, is that under certain historical circumstances, certain countries overextend themselves. They make more commitments than they can keep, and they go bust in the process. If you want a current example of exactly that sort of development, look to the Soviet Union.
Hugh Gallagher, when was the Depression actually over?
When World War II began. It was the armaments, the factories turning out the machine guns and the tanks and the airplanes that finally got America back to work.
Fresno, California. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Lamb. My name is Russell Hines. I'm in Fresno, California. I'm 75 years old, and I remember very well when I lived in Washington, D.C., on 1st Street Northeast, where now stands the Senate office building, that the men marched on Washington and pitched tents on the Capitol grounds, and they set up soup kitchens there. Since I only lived across the street, my dad took a pot, and he went over and got us some food. And in those days, that was very important. So, in my opinion, Mr. Roosevelt was a great man. He helped the people when he needed it the most, and I think we were just lucky to have him.
Let's go to Kansas City, Missouri next. What's your question or comment, please?
This is Kansas City, Missouri.
You're on the air.
I have always felt close kin to FDR since we share the same birthday, and I'm a member of the World War II generation. And I recall back in those days they had an annual birthday ball for the polio relief, and which led now to the March of Dimes. And I was wondering, FDR's fight against polio, reaction to that.
Mr. Gallagher, you're sitting in the March of Dimes room here, the display.
Yes, I am. One of the things we haven't said about Roosevelt is that during the years of his rehabilitation, and he took 7 long years, he was at Warm Springs, Georgia, and in the process, he and the other polios developed modern rehabilitation, developed functional training and independent living. And it is possible to say that the contribution he made there to disabled people around the world is fully as great as any other contribution he made. He was the founder of the Polio Foundation. He used his great fame as a way of raising money, and anyone who came down with polio, which is really a terrible disease, did not have to worry about the costs of medical care. When I got polio in '52, the March of Dimes came to my father and said, make sure your son has the best care possible, and we will see that the bills are paid. The March of Dimes not only helped polios, it also funded the research that led to the polio vaccine, and in the process, the development of modern study of viruses, which has led to so much in medical care.
Any of you can help me out on this. When you think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in those days, in Warm Springs, Georgia, he went down there on the railroad.
He did.
Car. When he came up here to Hyde Park, which is 2 hours north of New York, it was on the railroad car. And years before that, they used to go to Campobello, which is way up above Maine.
Yes.
Anybody know, either Ray Teichman or David Kennedy or Hugh Gallagher, do you know how long he used Campobello?
He never went back after he had polio. He developed polio at Campobello. And when he was president, he went back for a symbolic visit. But the house was up a hill, narrow little path, and the bedrooms were up on the second floor, and there was no way, as a paraplegic, that he could function in that house. But he loved Campobello. He'd been there almost every summer up until World War I.
It's the picture on the screen there from the museum. We go to Morgantown.
It's called, they always called it a cottage. But Eleanor, when she would go up and open the cottage in the summer, would take 8 servants with her.
Morgantown, North Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Hello. This is Morgantown, North Carolina. My name is Ron Moody. I was just sitting here watching, and I thought of my earlier life. I lost my grandfather and my father both early in life, but I do remember as a child sitting and listening to both of them just praise FDR. They were from the mountains of North Carolina out in Waynesville, and they were reasonably poor people. And I remember my grandfather and father both saying if it hadn't been for FDR, they would have probably starved to death. And it just my father worked for the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a program which was an offshoot of one of his programs, and I just hate to listen to these people that want to put him down and or anything. I just, all I ever heard in my young life was praise about him, and of course my young life came right after he was president. And my mother was from up in New Jersey, and she came from a not so poor family, but not real rich either. But all I ever heard from her was praise and about him, and I think that all I ever heard in my young life was praise about him, and I don't know where all this trying to make some kind of a villain out of him came from. But
thanks, caller. Well, let me just take the other side of it for a moment, because people listening there, not everybody out there is in love with FDR. 15 million people voted against him in 32. 16 million voted against him in 36. 22 million voted against him in 1940, and 22 million voted against him in 1944. Obviously, people didn't like him back then. Some of them, if you didn't like him back then, both Hugh Gallagher and Ray Teichman and also David Kennedy, why didn't you like him?
Well, the traditional reasons, I suppose, that people were afraid of the enlargement of the central government. It's a long theme in American history. They were afraid of what they regarded at that time as confiscatory tax rates, although from our perspective, looking back, that's kind of laughable, since the highest income tax rate on the eve of World War II was 4%. But measured against no income tax just a generation or so earlier, that seemed like the thin end of the wedge, the foot in the door. So I think it was those kinds of worries of a rather traditional sort, that the government was going to get too big, there were going to be too many encroachments on private lives, private initiative, the private economy, and so on.
Ray Teichman, you want to add anything? You've studied this man for 28 years.
I think, too, the fact that people were perhaps much more political party conscious back in those days. We tend to have a lot of independents nowadays, but I think people were more firmly devoted one way or another to the party, and they saw Roosevelt as a Democrat. And Mr. Roosevelt was a man who had spent virtually his entire life in politics, and he knew how to make political appointments. There are documents in the files showing him picking out people he thinks should be postmasters and other types. So just the general partisan feeling that existed at the time would certainly have led to criticism of him.
Hugh Gallagher, we've talked about this some, but he controlled, in the time that he was president, every single Congress, every single House, every single Senate, by big margins. It didn't even get close until Harry Truman was elected and the Republicans took over again. Can you give any credit to what happened back in those years to anybody in Congress, or does it all go to one man?
Oh, there were great congressmen at the time. This was back when seniority ruled the Congress. And so you had committee chairmen who had been in Congress for 20 years, and they had great institutional memory. And they were supportive of FDR, and he had to be very careful to keep on their good side. Talking about his popularity, my grandmother was a Republican, and I can remember her fears. She said, he's spending this nation into bankruptcy, and I don't care about me, but I'm worried about my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. We'll be a poor nation. And he was the most loved president, but he was also the most hated.
Shrewsbury, Pennsylvania, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Hi.
Great program, excellent series. I have a question for either one of your guests. It appears as if Roosevelt was infatuated with the term Shangri-La, which came from James Hilton's book, Lost Horizon. He originally had named Camp David Shangri-La, which was then changed by Eisenhower. He fixed Shangri-La to the secret location from where the Doolittle raid came from. And within the next year, he had even named an aircraft carrier Shangri-La. I'd like to hear a few comments on that. Thank you.
Hugh Gallagher?
I don't have any comments. It's a damn good novel, and it's the kind of novel that FDR would have read.
David Kennedy?
Good movie, too.
I can't add much more to that. It's just charming that he came up with that kind of whimsical name the way he did.
Ray Teichman, what else do you have to show us there or tell us about anything in particular?
Well, there's really so much that I wouldn't know where to begin. But one thing I did want to indicate, particularly one of Roosevelt's speeches, which he delivered in 1936 when he was renominated for the second term. And he talked about government in a way that, since Ronald Reagan, has perhaps been not too fashionable. He said that governments can err, and presidents do make mistakes. But the immortal Dante tells us that divine justice weighs the sins of the cold-blooded and the sins of the warm-hearted in different scales. Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. Quite a substantial quote, and as you can see from the document, a few notations made in his own handwriting.
Before we lose you, if you come here to do research, first of all, what kind of credentials do you have to have?
Well, your basic credential has to be an interest in the historical materials that we have here, and you can't get the information anyplace else. That's probably about fundamental. On the other hand, though, we try to reach as wide a population in the country as possible. We have education programs here for school groups. We attract quite a number of them each year.
Do you have a website?
Yes, we do. We have a website. You can get us at www.academic.marist.edu/FDR/.
What's the Marist?
Marist is the college, which is about 4 miles south of us. And they have a very large computer, and we operate through their computer to set up our website.
Ray Teichman, thank you very much for showing us the stacks there in the archive.
Well, thank you.
Marin City, California, you're next on the line.
Yeah, Horace Austin from Marin City, California. 2 quick questions for the guests. The first one is, when does the Churchill Roosevelt relationship start? And the second question is, if FDR could drop back in to this country today, what would he think of America? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, Churchill and Roosevelt actually met during World War I when Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty and Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It appears that Churchill never remembered that occasion. Roosevelt remembered it rather imperfectly. But the historic relationship really began when Churchill re-entered the British cabinet in 1940, and then when he became Prime Minister in the spring of 1940. And almost immediately he wrote to Roosevelt and initiated this correspondence, which now has been edited into 3 wonderful volumes by Warren Kimball at Rutgers University. And it's an extraordinary relationship, and not to mention an extraordinary correspondence between 2 heads of state who established a personal rapport with one another and cemented this alliance between England and the United States in World War II.
As we take the next call, we're going to look at a montage of different shots of FDR. We go to Baltimore next. What would you like to tell us this morning?
Yes, this is George Wills, and I live in Baltimore and am a real admirer of C-SPAN. What you have done, Brian, and another good friend of mine over there, Maura Pierce, to make history and public affairs come alive is the best contribution to television since it started. And I wanted just to share 2 incidents that occurred when I was 8 years old at the time that kindled my excitement about history and public life and politics. First was being awakened early in the morning on June 6, 1944 by my parents. We lived out in the country north of Baltimore. My father was a school teacher, and we heard the FDR prayer for the troops landing on Normandy that morning. And for a kid that age, it was enormously powerful. And the second was the day that Franklin Roosevelt died, and I happened to be listening to a Tom Mix cowboy program and heard it on the radio. And my parents were having my aunt and uncle in for dinner that evening. And my uncle, and I love them all, was a very conservative businessman. And I went in to tell them that the radio had just said that Roosevelt died. And for the first time in my life, I saw my mother openly cry. She was a very aristocratic kind of lady. And I looked over at my uncle, and he said, "Thank God that SOB from Hyde Park is gone." And my whole excitement about history was ignited in that moment when those 2 totally different views were conveyed. And I think you've done an extraordinary job in making this life of this, unique and courageous leader come alive to Americans today.
Thank you, and thanks for your nice comments about Maura Pierce, our history producer. We're going to meet Alita Black in just a moment. She is an authority on Eleanor Roosevelt. Today is Eleanor Roosevelt's, I think I counted 115 birthdays. Salem, Oregon, next call. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Hi.
This is Hardy Elliott from Salem, Oregon, and I wanted to comment on how the war began. Roosevelt wanted to disarm the world. I hate war. He got up and gave speeches. I hate war. I'm going to disarm the world. In grade school, I was taught that this was the most powerful nation. Lindbergh informed Roosevelt time and time again that they was arming against us. He visited Germany and he says their armed forces are superior to ours. We need to build up. Roosevelt got up and says we can whip Japan in 30 days. And he got so angry with Colonel Lindbergh that he stripped him of his colonelship. I got turned down for the service, went to work at the Willow Run bomber plant, became a supervisor, 127 men under me for a while, and I talked to Lindbergh. Lindbergh flew, I think it was 58 missions. Roosevelt denied him entrance, but Colonel Lindbergh helped us get the B-24 bomber and the Ford Willow Run plant, Michigan. He helped us get it under production. And
Thanks,
I was
caller.
taught that this was the most powerful nation in grade school, and it was a Christian nation, and no nation or group of nations would ever dare challenge us. We were the only ones that disarmed. Now Roosevelt gets credit for building up the armed forces, but he deteriorated them.
Hugh Gallagher, do you have any comment on that?
I don't believe that's true. He had many isolationists in the Congress. The Republicans opposed his efforts to rearm, and in fact, the draft barely passed with only a one-vote majority. It was a very difficult period for FDR because he could see war coming and very frustrating.
Let's watch that clip of the I Hate War that the caller was talking about. We have it ready to run. Let's see what it looked like.
I have seen war. I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen men coughing out their gasped lungs. I have seen the dead in the mud. I have seen cities destroyed. I have seen 200 limping, exhausted men come out of line, the survivors of a regiment of 1,000 that went forward 48 hours before. I have seen children starving. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war.
David Kennedy, want to add anything to this?
Well, of course, Roosevelt hated war. Who doesn't? He was in a lot of good company. William Tecumseh Sherman said, "War is hell." Robert E. Lee said, "It is good that war is so terrible, else we should come to love it so." I mean, any sane, right-thinking person hates war. And as Hugh Gallagher, I think, rightly said, it's simply not true that Roosevelt disarmed the country. The country disarmed after World War I when Roosevelt was nowhere on the political scene. And it was Roosevelt's great task as a leader from about 1935 on, when he began to sense just how dangerous the world was becoming, that he had to educate the country and convince the Congress to begin a rearmament program, and he faced tremendous opposition.
One more call, then Alita Black. Des Moines, Iowa. You're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like some comments from one of the guests on one of my favorite Roosevelt projects, and that is Mrs. Nesbitt. I've read so much on the White House food and how bad it was and how bad or good a White House housekeeper was. I'd like some comments on Mrs. Nesbitt.
Hugh Gallagher, you smiled. You must know.
Eleanor brought Mrs. Nesbitt from Hyde Park to the White House, and it's true, the food was awful. And in fact, FDR sometimes would send out for pizza. At state dinners, many people took to eating beforehand rather than having to eat Mrs. Nesbitt's food. And Eleanor, I have no understanding, no reason why, but Eleanor was always a very strong defender of Mrs. Nesbitt and refused to replace her.
Alita Black, how long have you been thinking about studying, writing about Eleanor Roosevelt?
Well, really since about the mid-'70s, Brian, but I started in earnest in '84.
Why?
Well, because the more I looked at FDR and the things that I liked about FDR, Eleanor had a hand in, and I really felt like she was getting short shrift by a lot of the folks who were looking at FDR's accomplishments.
Where do you look at the world from now? Where's your life's perch?
Well, I'm at George Washington University in Washington, D.C.
Have you written about Eleanor Roosevelt recently?
I've had 3 books on Eleanor. The most recent one is a compilation of her political writings entitled Courage in a Dangerous World.
What do you think she would think about today's ceremony that's going to go on here for her birthday celebration?
Well, I think she would be pleased that people would remember, but I suspect that she wouldn't want all the fuss unless some organization that she believed in could make some money off of it.
What do you think she did that mattered the most?
Well, I think she gave a vision to the country that really helped us get through not only the Depression and the war, but helped us cope with the horrors of the Holocaust and the horrors of war, especially with the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which she was the principal architect in creating.
Right where Alita Black is, right behind it is where the gravesite is here at the Hyde Park home of FDR. And you can see it on your screen there. The gravesite, I mean, that stone is not where they're buried. They're buried in front there. The president is buried with the flag, and right in front of that is where Eleanor Roosevelt is. Behind that stone, 2 dogs are buried, Chief and Fala, 2 of the dogs that belong to the Roosevelt family. As we take a call from Baltimore, Maryland. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I have a comment and a question for Dr. Kennedy. You were talking about Henry Morgenthau. My understanding was that sometime in 1944, Morgenthau received representatives from the Warsaw Uprising who came to warn Morgenthau that the program of extermination was not only continuing but getting stronger. Morgenthau urged the president, because at this point the United States Air Force and the British Air Force completely dominated Europe. There was no resistance from the Luftwaffe at all. He urged the president to bomb the rail depots and the yards to halt the shipping of Jews, which actually accelerated towards the end of the war. For example, most of the Hungarian Jews died in the last few months of the war, and Italian Jews. For some reason, he failed to comply or pay any attention to that. I also would point out his attitude during the Spanish Civil War, when he, if I'm not mistaken, if an American went to join usually the Lincoln Brigade, his citizenship would be revoked. And this was, I suppose, in response to pressure from the Catholics in America. Could you comment on that?
Well, you're absolutely right. People on Morgenthau's staff, and with Morgenthau's encouragement, put together in 1944 a report called, rather chilling title. The report had the title, "On the Acquiescence of This Government in the Murder of the European Jews." And it led, Morgenthau, was the only Jew in the cabinet, brought this report to Roosevelt, and eventually that led to the formation of the War Refugee Board. And in turn, it was the War Refugee Board, or representative of the board, who brought the recommendation to the War Department that the rail lines to Auschwitz be bombed. That's a complicated story. I would say we need to remember the decision was made not to bomb those rail lines. One item you need to remember in thinking about that is that the request came in August of 1944, when many people thought after the breakout at Normandy the war was just weeks from being over if maximum pressure could be kept up on the Germans in the West without any diversion of effort. And that, I think, was the context in which the decision was made not to divert bomber strength to the Auschwitz mission.
Arlington, Virginia, go ahead, please.
Yes, question for Dr. Black. If she could comment on Eleanor Roosevelt's role in Democratic politics from the death of Franklin up to the John Kennedy race in 1960.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. In fact, I think I know this caller. What Eleanor basically did was help articulate a vision for the Democratic Party that really helped it stay focused after FDR. Because when we look at Truman, we think of give him hell Harry. He doesn't really become that until the second term. And so after FDR's death, the party is really floundering and it's splintering into different factions. And so what Eleanor skillfully does is help keep the New Deal alive, but also help fine-tune the New Deal so that we can deal with the issues of civil rights and housing and minimum wage and the right to work in safe places and the right to engage in a spirited public debate about what it means to live in a democracy. And so she really helped hold the Democratic Party leaders accountable. And in fact, she was such a force in the party that Secretary Ickes wants her to run for governor for the state of New York. David Dubinsky and Sidney Hillman, big labor leaders, want her to run NCPAC, which is the Major Political Action Committee. There are several women's colleges who want to come recruit her to be president of the colleges. And in fact, her newspaper column, which by then was an overtly political column was the most syndicated political column in the country. So she was always out there goading the Democrats to try to practice what they preach.
How often did she write that column, Alita Black?
Well, Brian, she wrote it every day, 6 days a week, and she missed 2 deadlines from December 1935 until October 1962. One was when FDR died, and another when she was out of the country and was in Russia and was prevented from filing that because of a blizzard in Russia that knocked out the teletype.
What would have been the biggest paper that she published that column in?
Well, probably the New York Herald Tribune, although she was in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She was in the L.A. papers, the Chicago papers, the Dallas papers. I mean, it was syndicated all over the country.
Next call. We got to grab some calls here before we run out of time. We go to San Francisco. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I'm calling from San Francisco. I was born in the Depression and an immigrant family, Jewish, and I saw Franklin and Eleanor as coming from the aristocracy and challenging the whole tenets of that aristocracy in terms of laissez-faire capitalism. And it was magnificent to have every single one of these tenets challenged and a demand for responsibility. This is what he asked of the very group that he came from. And his greatness lies in a vision, and that vision has not changed. It gave us equality among many groups that were so disenfranchised they considered themselves nothing but tools. He was the antidote to Henry Ford. And that is greatness. We're trying to get back to that right now. Only Wall Street is trying to do it. We need another Franklin.
All right, sir, thank you. Let's go to Tucson, Arizona next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning, Brian. I guess first what I'd like to say, so many others have, that I think this is the best yet, this presidential series that you've done on C-SPAN. You've done some wonderful things, but this one has been just fantastic. My question is, if anyone could speak to it, why did President Roosevelt run that final time? He had to know how very, very ill he was, and he had to know that the war was going our way. And concomitant with that, I'd like someone to talk about why he chose so many different vice presidents and vice presidents who weren't terribly strong. I mean, now we're used to a vice president who's sort of trained in the way of being a leader himself. And it's always puzzled me that Roosevelt first would run when he was so ill, and secondly, did not seem to rely very heavily on the vice presidents or think of them as future presidents.
Thanks. Let me ask Alita Black to tell us what Eleanor Roosevelt wanted her husband to do back in 1944 when he ran for the 4th time. Do you know?
Well, she encouraged him to run. She was worried about him, but they both believed that the war was so close and that the world faced so many challenges in trying to rebuild from the trauma of war that it would be very detrimental to have a new leader come in at that point. And Roosevelt also thought that he had developed a pretty good relationship with Stalin so that he could handle Stalin in the post-war era. And so I think the short answer to a very complicated question would be they were hoping to get through the war and then deal with Reconstruction, and then Roosevelt could sit back and let the vice president come in and take over domestic policy.
The caller in Tucson said that the vice presidents, and there were 3 of them, were weak. I don't know if she would use the word weak, but John Nance Garner was Speaker of the House. Was he a weak choice back in...
I would disagree. I mean, I would say that Truman was a weak choice for vice president, and Truman really was very much a compromise candidate in 44 because the conservatives in the party were desperate to get rid of Wallace. The liberals in the party wanted William O. Douglas, who declined it, and so Truman was accepted as a compromise candidate.
David Kennedy, when he picked Henry Wallace his 3rd term, what was he at that time? What had he been doing?
Wallace had been Secretary of Agriculture, and he was regarded as one of the most loyal New Dealers. He had been a Republican. And his appointment as vice president, bringing him into the New Deal fold, was part of Roosevelt's effort to enlarge the Democratic Party by including progressive Republicans.
When he ran for the president and got 1 million votes in, 48?
Yes.
What was his party then?
Well, then he ran on it was called briefly the Progressive Party. But Wallace, by that point, had moved well to the left of the New Deal and indeed was supported prominently by the Communist Party.
Walnut Creek, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes,
Walnut.
this is Marlis Kim from Walnut Creek.
Go right ahead.
And thank you again for the wonderful series you're doing. I wanted to ask about the effect you think that FDR's speaking ability had on his re-elections, particularly in 1940 when he was running against Wendell Willkie. I was a teenager in Waterloo, Iowa, and Wendell Willkie came through on the train, and which, by the way, my father was an engineer on that train, taking him from Waterloo to Freeport, Illinois. And Wendell Willkie was a terrible speaker. In fact, his voice was so hoarse he could hardly speak at all. And I always felt that FDR had a beautiful speaking voice, and particularly also Winston Churchill. And I think they were two great orators.
Thanks, caller. Hugh Gallagher, how about that?
Oh, that's true. FDR had a brilliant sense of how to use the radio. He was the first president to use mass communications, and he had a marvelous voice. And in the 1940 campaign, he was lucky. Wendell Willkie lost his voice. Every one of his 4 campaigns, he would give a funny speech, and you would listen for it. And in the 1940, it was about the isolationists Martin, Barton, and Fish, and he got the audience chanting with him, Martin, Barton, and Fish. And I still remember hearing that on the radio.
Next call, Jacksonville, Florida. You're on the air. Hello, Jacksonville.
This is David Russell in Jacksonville, Florida. When I was 10 years old, in early 1933, Roosevelt, the first thing he did upon being elected was come down to Jacksonville and go for a fishing trip on Vincent Astor's yacht, the Norma. Now, there's an interesting footnote to history. Why did he do all this just after being elected? Because on board that ship was a man known as George Hill. He was the political leader of the Democratic Party for Florida. And he was very instrumental in getting the nomination against Al Smith and so forth. And later during the voting, he precipitated the election. And probably, this is a little footnote hardly anybody knows, but he probably got Roosevelt the presidency.
David Kennedy?
Well, you know, there was much less urgency about a new administration taking over at that time because, as it happens, it was the last occasion, 1932-33, when there was about a 5-month interval between the election and the inauguration, which didn't take place until March of 1933. So Roosevelt had some time to relax at the end of the campaign. Of course, the other thing that happened on that same trip that you've mentioned is that there was an assassination attempt on Roosevelt, and that the bullet missed FDR and killed the person sitting in the seat of the automobile next to him, Mayor Cermak from Chicago. So that was quite a dramatic occasion.
Alita Black, not far from here, about 2 miles, is often mentioned Valkill home of Eleanor Roosevelt. We're going to have some video on. Tell us, when did she start using this home and why?
Well, Valkill was really built in 1925, and it was built with Eleanor and 2 friends, Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook, and they wanted to have a retreat, a place where a bunch of people could go together and picnic and have a great time. And it was named Valkill for the creek by which the cottage was built. And the 3 women all went to FDR, and FDR gave them the land, and FDR was an active supporter of it. In fact, he designed a lot of the structures that are there. And it's had a great and varied history. They ran a Valkill furniture factory there during the Depression to try to train unskilled artisans from Hyde Park and Dutchess County on how to make early American reproductions so that they could sell this furniture and try to get some money during the Depression. And then it was also a site of very famous picnics. I mean, we talked earlier about how the King and Queen came to Springwood. They also went to Valkill. And then after FDR's death, it became Mrs. Roosevelt's primary home. And it's where she always called it her first home of her own.
Augusta, Maine. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Thank you, Brian. Great show. Fantastic. Paul Reese, Augusta, Maine. The question, up here in Maine, we're very proud of Francis Perkins. And I would like the historians to comment on how FDR was so far ahead of his time on appointing a woman to the cabinet? Thank you.
Yes, she was the first woman cabinet member ever. She served throughout all of Roosevelt's terms. She was one of the 2 or 3 longest-serving cabinet members in all the New Deal administrations. And interestingly, particularly given the fact she was Secretary of Labor, she did not come out of the organized labor movement. She was a social worker. So not only was she a woman, but she was also a different kind of Secretary of Labor. And many people have observed that the appointment of a social worker as Secretary of Labor indicated Roosevelt's basic reflexive attitude toward the working class was he wanted to do things for them in the manner of a social worker rather than empowering them to do things for themselves.
Martin County, Florida. What would you like to say?
Yeah, Brian, I have a question for the gentleman about Harry Hopkins, who was brought up recently, about 15, 20 minutes ago. I recently read an article in the New York Times about a Russian author named, I believe his name is Mitovsky, who is a former KGB agent that defected about 10 years ago and brought several trunkloads of papers, KGB papers. And in his book, he's written and revealed the name of a number of Soviet agents, or whatever you want to call them, moles that were within the Roosevelt administration during the war in the 30s. And I'm pretty sure Harry Hopkins is one of the names that was identified. Could either of you two gentlemen expand a little bit on who Harry Hopkins was and what his role in the administration was? And also, are they familiar with this information which has recently come out?
Thanks, caller. Hugh Gallagher, you want to try that?
Harry Hopkins was FDR's right-hand man during the war. He was his confidential assistant, and he served as a liaison with Churchill and then later with Stalin. His role was very important, and he was a great American. And a lot of stories have come out of the KGB files, and I don't put much faith in any book that says Harry Hopkins was other than a very loyal American.
We've talked to Hugh Gallagher about the effects of polio on an individual, and when he got it when he was 19 years old. I want to ask Alita Black, what was the effect of the relationship between Eleanor and FDR when he got polio at age 39?
Well, they had a very complicated relationship. There'd already been trouble in the marriage, which they had tried to work out. And when polio hit FDR, Eleanor was just absolutely adamant that, in fact, it should not cripple his spirit the way it had crippled his body. And so she, working very closely with Louis Howe, ran interference between those political leaders and family members who wanted Roosevelt to retire here and just to live a life of ease. Eleanor was just adamantly opposed to that. And so she rose to the challenge like she rose to so many challenges in her life.
Next week, of course, we'll be doing the 33rd President of the United States. Harry Truman will be at his library in Independence, Missouri. And as you know, all these programs are rerun on Friday evening at 8 o'clock East Coast time. Once again, I want to give you the number to call if you're a teacher. And teachers that are home today on this Columbus Day can call this number or reach us through the website. If you want to sign up for C-SPAN in the classroom, it's 202-626-4858 and cspan.org/classroom. Folks are there now to take the call. There's no charge for any of this. We'll provide you with lesson plans and backup material so that you can use this video and the material we've put on our website, which we have AmericanPresidents.org. Is available there at 202-626-4858 and cspan.org/classroom. We go next to Ellensburg, Washington, state where David Kennedy came from originally. Go ahead, Ellensburg.
This is Louis Alexander, Ellensburg, Washington. I had polio in 1932. In 1942, I stood at parade rest at the San Diego Naval Air Station when President Roosevelt toured and viewed the naval troops there. And the question I have is for Mr. Gallagher. I'm enthused about the memorial that you're building in Washington for paraplegics, and I wonder about your thoughts on motorized wheelchairs. Why do you use one, and what is the pluses and minuses? And I thank Brian for the series. I've taped every one of the series so far. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Gallagher.
I think Roosevelt would love an electric power wheelchair. I used the manual for many years, but now that I'm in a power chair, I find I have great independence, and he would have loved it.
Do you drive?
I do. I have a van. I drive from my wheelchair, and I have almost as much independence as I had before polio.
Medford, Oregon next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, it's Mary Brad Lawrence. I wanted to ask Professor Kennedy whether he felt that Herbert Hoover took an undue amount of blame for the Depression.
Well, the short answer is yes. The Depression was a worldwide phenomenon. It's not the responsibility of any single individual or even any single national economy. Of course, Hoover got tagged with the responsibility for it. I think that was quite a distortion of the record, and it's also the fact that Hoover tried rather strenuously to do something about it. That's also not part of the folklore, but I believe it's true.
Our technical expert on the spot here for this trip, Jim Clark. Our director this morning, Brett Betzel. Our next call, San Diego, California. Hello there.
Hello. Brian?
Yes.
I want to compliment you on your series. I'm recording all of it, and I go to the internet and get the other information. But the reason I'm calling is my name is Ann Cole, and I'm from San Diego. And actually, I was brought up in Coronado, California, which is right across the bay. And I would like to find out who some of the did FDR have several physicians? Because I knew this woman who was supposed to be very important, and she was married to Dr. McIntyre, who was, as I understand, this is when I was a very little girl, was Roosevelt's private physician. Do you know anything about this?
Hugh Gallier?
Yeah, Admiral McIntyre was the president's doctor. He was a specialist in ear, nose, and throat. Roosevelt always suffered from sinus trouble. He has a very controversial position in history. He had access to the medical records of FDR in the last years. The medical records have disappeared. We do not know how accurately the physical problems that FDR had were diagnosed, and it would be wonderful if we could find those documents.
Alita Black, what would be the relationship, do you think, of Eleanor Roosevelt to the public today, given all of the difference being television today? How do you think she would have gotten along in these days?
Oh, she was a master at the media. I mean, she used radio before FDR used radio. And in fact, one of the sacrifices that she had to make to become First Lady was to cancel all her media contracts. And after she left the White House, she joined television again, and in fact had her own TV show from Brandeis. Before there was PBS, there was, education television. And so Eleanor was a forerunner of public interest television and would use it with great skill.
Anything about her you didn't like?
Yeah. I mean, she called her papers before she left her material here. In fact, she pulled out some of the papers that really showed what an influence she had. She really acquiesced on internment after speaking out voraciously against it for about 7 or 8 months. And she was a great politician, and she believed that politics was a noble calling. So when she did compromise, she always really felt like that she was doing it for a pragmatic reason, when perhaps on some issues I would have liked her to goad a little more.
Austin, Texas, you're next.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for this series. It's the most magnificent thing I've ever watched on television. I appreciate it deeply. And my comment is, as a person from a middle-class family, I was a child at the time Roosevelt came in. My father had died when my father was about 19. He had a wife and little children to take care of, and he didn't know what was going to happen the next day, whether he would have his job or not. And he had no one to fall back on. He didn't know what he was going to do. I didn't know this as a child. I was protected from all this. I learned later. But what I do know is that when Franklin Roosevelt died, it was the first time I had ever seen tears on my father's face. He felt that he had lost his only friend. This man meant that much to him. And what I want to say to follow that is that the young people now do not understand. I don't believe what kind of fear this was. And the last thing I want to say is that I hope our citizens will remember that this man was so hated that he was one of the first to say we need national health care. Thank you.
Your book is called Freedom from Fear. It's in the bookstores right now. The reason I bring it up is because there were 4 freedoms, I think. Where did that come from?
It comes from this Roosevelt speech in January of 1941. It's actually the speech that introduces the Lend-Lease bill to the Congress, which he says there are 4 things worth fighting for in the world. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. I think in the last analysis, freedom from fear is the gifts that Roosevelt gave to his country and to the world. He reduced a lot of fears in American life. You know, in some ways, Brian, it's so appropriate to do a program about Roosevelt from this house, and with all the grace and the security of the way of life that this great mansion represents. For all its simplicity, it's still a great house. And I do think that Roosevelt's historic achievement in the last analysis was to impart to millions of his countrymen the kind of security in life that the Roosevelts had taken for granted for generations.
We have cameras all around, some 6 cameras on the grounds and a couple of movable cameras. Bob Riley has a camera on the other side of the house from where we're sitting here. And the reason I want to show the audience this is if he can slowly swing around, the Hudson River is behind him, and as he moves off to, I don't know which way he's going to go, to the left, the Hudson River and the railroad tracks are right down below that. But across the Hudson on the other side, and one of the guides told me this earlier, is the house of Father Divine. I wondered if anybody, I know David Kennedy and I were talking about Father Divine earlier. Hugh Gallagher, do you remember the name?
No, I don't, no.
One of the preachers. Do you remember much about him?
Not much. He's an African American religious leader. I think of him more as a post-World War II figure, but I don't know that much about him. To be
There's
honest.
the houses. You'll see it there on the screen. I don't know. I just wanted you to see that this is what they told me. We don't know much about it. Alita Black, I'm going to try you. Do you know much about Father Divine?
I know a little bit. I mean, he was kind of in the tradition of Marcus Garvey, who was a famous African-American leader in the 20s. He surfaced again in the late 30s, came up in the war, but really became a more overtly political figure after the war, when he really tried to galvanize African Americans to deal with the issues of racial discrimination in employment.
Our 3 guests came from far away and are going back to faraway places. David Kennedy came all the way from Stanford just to be on our program. Alita Black came from Washington but is flying out of New York to Brazil later on today. Hugh Gallagher spent 8.5 hours in the car to get up here from Washington yesterday and heads back after this program. I want to thank all 3 of you for making an extra effort. We don't have much time left. Cynthia Cook is the director of this library, only been here a couple of months. Thank you. Lynn Bassanese, big help to all of us all day yesterday and today, clearing the way. Bruce McKeeman, who's the deputy director here, has helped us from day one. Sarah Olson, the site superintendent. Everybody here couldn't be any nicer than they've been. Media One, the cable system in the area. Their trucks were out here earlier this morning. Next call, Edison, New Jersey. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
How you doing? I'm enjoying the show. I got a comment and I guess a question for Professor Kennedy. I'm interested in the great man theory of history myself, and for those earlier callers who made mention about FDR not being so great, I just thought it would be worth reminding them that he had steered a course between the great isms of the time, socialism on the one hand, fascism on the other hand. But my question is, I was wondering, Professor Kennedy, along the lines of, I understand the New Deal was heavily borrowed from an author by the name of Stuart Chase, and Chase was a student of Thorsten Veblen, the economist who also taught at Stanford for a while, but at Chicago. Can you elaborate on that, any kind of relationship and that idea of institutionalism as a middle ground between the evils of capitalism, if you will, and the evils of communism and National Socialism that was rampant at the time?
Well, the New Deal, of course, has a complicated intellectual and political genealogy, and Thorsten Veblen and Stuart Chase are contributors to it. But it comes generally, you might say, in the broadest sense of the term, the New Deal comes out of a tradition of thinking that was not new by the 1930s. It had been around for generations, that absolutely buccaneering, freewheeling, unregulated free market capitalism needed some degree of political restraint, kind of security built into it for ordinary people and to stabilize economic institutions if the whole thing were going to hang together.
Don't have much time left, and I want the three guests that we have here to help me go through very quickly, we have to do this quickly, the things that FDR was about at the time. I mean, I'm looking at my sheet here. He won 4 times the presidency, and there were usually in those period 37 to 45 million votes cast, and he would win by 6 or 7 million votes. He controlled both the House and the Senate throughout his entire 12 years as president. He started things like, or got things passed like the TVA and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FCC, the Federal Housing Administration, the FBI, the Social Security, started in August of 1935. Cabinet officers. Who wants to jump in and tell us who his cabinet officers was, besides Cordell Hull, who's at Secretary of State? David Kennedy?
Well, again, the longest-serving ones were Harold Ickes at Interior, Francis Perkins at Labor, Henry Wallace at Agriculture.
Henry Stimson?
Well, Stimson comes in later as Secretary of War. Henry Morgenthau at Treasury. And again, it's remarkable, particularly given the political era that we live in, is the commitment that these people made to stay on board at this level of high public service for up to a dozen years.
Hugh Gallagher, something else that you want to add that he did during his time?
I think what I'd like to add is the importance of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was in every way an equal partner of FDR. FDR would not have become president without her work in the 20s and 30s. She always kept FDR on track, and her record after FDR died, her record at the UN, makes her a very major figure.
Alita Black, hold on just a second. We'll take a call. Springfield, New Jersey, you're next. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, hi, this is Esther Eisenberg, Lauren Bellevaux, and Pam Chow, calling from Springfield, New Jersey. And I was just wondering, what was FDR's education when he was young?
Were you, are you part of the group that called earlier?
No, another group.
Are you a high school student?
Yes, I am, from Mr. Lassie's class.
So you get another 20 points now. Now that you called, he ought to give you another 10 points, don't you think?
Yeah.
Alita Black, can you help her with that question?
Sure. FDR went to Groton, which was a private academy here. Then he went to Harvard, where he was a C student. And then he went to law school and got bored with law school, dropped out after about 1.5 years, but then passed the bar.
How long did he serve as an attorney in private practice?
I'm not really sure about that. David may have a better idea. I want to say about 4 or 5 years, but he never really practiced in earnest.
I think that's absolutely right. He was never a fully practicing attorney.
Hugh Gallagher, did he work for an insurance company for a while? I remember seeing somewhere on the list.
Oh, yes, he did. And he had a lot of crazy investments, but his life was principally one of public service.
Last call, Manhattan Beach, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Brian. You're terrific. A little rain on your parade. 2 separate items that correlate concerning FDR getting us into the war. One was a Marine, retired Marine general pointed out how in May of 41 he sent individual battleships, one at a time, 3 in succession, over to the British Isles from the east coast of the United States, off the sea lanes by themselves, which is a very unique way for a warship to conduct itself. And only one of them was shot at with torpedoes, and it was obviously an effort to get one of them sunk to get us in the war. And then secondly, West Pointers, formerly West Pointers, have told me how they studied that American submarines were involved early in 1941 under a British flag shooting at German ships in order to get us in the war also. Would you comment, please?
David Kennedy?
Well, I don't know the specific episodes you're referring to, and I dare say they sound kind of dubious. The fact is, by the time Roosevelt made the decision to let American naval vessels escort or convoy the merchant marine shipments to Britain in the fall of 1941, there were several shooting incidents on the Atlantic. And rather interestingly, neither Hitler nor Roosevelt chose to seize upon one of those incidents as an occasion for asking for a declaration of war. So, for good reason, I think, on Roosevelt's part, because he understood that in the fall of 1941, the United States was not ready for war. It wouldn't do any good to ask for a declaration of war when he didn't have any Navy or Army to fight with.
We also want to thank the library for their archival footage that we've been able to show you. Alita Black, earlier I was asking about things that happened during the Roosevelt years, and we do not by any means think this is a definitive program on them, but can you add anything that we haven't mentioned?
Sure. I think one thing now that we really need to look at is the role that the Roosevelts played in beginning federal aid to education and also involving public funds in the production of art. You have the Federal One programs with the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Theater Projects, the Federal Artists Projects, which Eleanor was a great champion of. And also you have the National Youth Administration, which helped give kind of an early version of AmeriCorps, kids that needed money to go to school to go to college and help keep a lot of colleges open. So there's a real smorgasbord of accomplishments in the New Deal, and I think the major legacy was that the government should try, and if it doesn't work, then admit that it doesn't work, scrap it, and begin something else.
Hugh Gallagher, anything you want to finish with?
Yes, he gave us a sense that we're all in this together, and it's something that we could use today.
Hugh Gallagher is sitting in the museum in the March of Dimes exhibit here at the FDR Library. And David Kennedy, last comment from you?
Well, I think Roosevelt and the people around him changed. One would have used to, not many years ago, would have said forever, but I think that's now, we wouldn't say that. But he changed Americans' attitude toward government, and he represented the idea that government was the servant of the people and could be used for the collective good. And I think that's a very valuable lesson for us to remember in this era in which there's so much skepticism about the value of government.
There's a lot more to learn from our three guests and a lot of other people who have written about presidents. As we've said many times on this program, Hugh Gallagher has a book called FDR's Splendid Deception. And David Kennedy's new book, Freedom from Fear, out just a couple of months in the bookstores, a hardback. Alita Black has 3 books, as she said. She's the author of Casting Her Own Shadow, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Shaping of Post-War Liberalism. By the way, Alita Black, any new books coming out soon from you?
Well, hopefully I'll be editor of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers, which will be a project at the National Archives next year.
And David Kennedy, the new editor-in-chief of the Oxford
History of the United States.
What's next for that?
Well, we don't know. There'll be about a half dozen more volumes, but we're not quite sure what'll be the next one out of the chute.
And Hugh Gallagher, anything new from you coming up?
Well, I'm writing and fighting for disability rights.
Thank you all, and thanks to our audience, 62 callers today participating in this program, the 32nd President of the United States, from FDR's Hyde Park home. Have a good day.